unanswered and basically explains nothing. Why are these holy women depicted here and no others? Why in this order and in this combination? What connects them and what do they stand for? What is meant to be expressed by the particular way in which they are depicted? I am especially interested in the combination of Thekla and Radegundis, although I am much more familiar with Thekla than Radegundis due to my previous work on Apocrypha. I will proceed as follows. First, in a first step, I will present important dimensions of late antique memory of Thekla and consider which aspects of it could be expressed in the depiction in the Cappella Palatina and which are probably not. Second, I will consider what it might mean that Thekla is associated first and foremost with two other figures, Sancta Spes, that is the representation of the virtue of hope in the medallion above her, and Saint Radegundis in the same format in the column next to Thekla and below a medallion with Sancta Fides. This combination can only be understood when we consider the entire series of depictions of women in which the two appear side by side. Only then it is maybe possible to approach the question what this particular constellation might express. I begin with something where I'm more at home, dimensions of the memory of Thekla. To my knowledge, there are no studies on the significance of Thekla in Norman Sicily. Although near Catania in Acireale there is evidence of the existence of a Byzantine-era church dedicated to Saint Thekla, no remains of it exist today. Yesterday I found a Thekla also in Monreale, and I don't know about Cefalu. In any case, I have been unable to find any evidence of an intense devotion to Thekla, sometimes associated with the existence of relics, as it can be found in the Latin-speaking world in Spain, particularly in Catalonia, and in the east in parts of Asia Minor and Armenia, but for example also the Balkans. In order to understand what could initially be associated with the figure Thekla, I do not consider it essential to repeat the entire narrative of the Acts of Paul and Thekla, or even the much later Byzantine work on the life and miracles of Thekla. I assume that neither of these narratives would have been known in detail to the medieval viewers of the mosaics. It seems more promising to explore the question of which elements of a remembered or virtual Thekla had a chance to be associated with the image. So what does the symbolic figure Thekla stand for in various contexts, and what could she stand for? In an earlier study of crystallization points in the memory of Thekla, I highlighted the following aspects in particular. Number one, the ideal virgin. Particularly important and perhaps underlying all other aspects is Thekla's perfect virginity, with which she breaks out of the usual role models reserved for her as a woman of the upper class of Iconium. In a first step, she decides against marrying her intended fiancé, Thamyris. As a consequence, she not only suffers and survives the first martyrdom in Iconium, but also loses her status as first among the Iconians after being disowned by her family. This aspect of her decision is perhaps even more clearly emphasized in the life of Thekla than in the Acts. As Paul's companion without this status, she can now easily be mistaken for a prostitute, and in the scenes of the second part set in Antioch, she almost falls victim to the sexual assaults of the influential Alexander. When she defends herself, she once again violates the role assigned to her and is subjected to renewed martyrdom, which she miraculously survives. At the same time, however, her status changes once again. Queen Tryphaena, who once lost her biological daughter Falconilla, accepts Thekla in her daughter's place. Precisely because of her strict decision to remain a virgin, Thekla loses her status and regains it, perhaps in an even higher form, after her second martyrdom. Around her and Tryphaena, something like a community of Christian women with an alternative way of life emerges, which later became increasingly attractive also to other women, so this way of life, especially those from the upper and highest classes, and it is reminiscent of monastic life. Second, Ultimately, it is her radical decision to break away from everything that her life and the urban society of Iconium had planned for her, that although she survives both attempts to execute her, makes her not only a martyr, or even a proto-martyr along Stephen, refuting prejudices about the characteristics of women, and developing virtues that are actually reserved for men. This is another very important point. She is the one who has mainly virtues. Interestingly, none of her male opponents, Thamyris or Alexander, but also none of her judges can demonstrate these virtues according to the texts. Both points lead to Thekla's femininity as well as that of the women who follow her on a familiar path in life, always being portrayed as precarious. In other words, she is and remains a woman, for the sources of course, but a woman who, despite her extraordinary beauty, which is emphasized especially in the later life of Thekla, this beauty can no longer be understood in terms of the socially prescribed categories of femininity. Third, this and her repeated probation again as a steadfast Christ follower not only allows her to baptize herself, the one who is initially regarded as a learner, based on the words of Paul, increasingly develops into a teacher who, depending on the text, can also be regarded as a theologian of high standing. This is very important for the life of Thekla. She thus stands as a model for the exceptionally prudent woman who, following the life of Thekla, proves to be an ideal teacher of Nicene Constantinopolitan orthodoxy. The special way in which she repeatedly proved herself as a witness to the faith in extreme situations means that she can be understood as a saint, as apostolic, or at least in some testimonies, even an apostle. Time and again, she becomes a role model for women who, in a similar life decision, usually under the spiritual guidance of a man, act as theologians or are interested in theology. Some of these women, such as Macrina, Olympias of Constantinople, or Eusebia Xene, are also ordained deaconesses. 4. Through her intercession for the deceased pagan Falconilla, Thekla can be understood as a special intercessor transcending religious boundaries even beyond death. This is what I learned from Andrea Riedl. 5. Particularly attractive was her reputation as an extremely powerful miracle worker, as propagated especially in the miracles of Thekla. According to this text, she not only took over the function of the ancient sanctuaries of the Greco-Roman cults, but could also be invoked in place of the oracles to learn about the future. She was not only open to individual needs. If one follows the miracles of Thekla, she also granted her hometown of Seleucia protection against military attacks. 6. Emperor Zeno the Isaurian, end of the 5th century, in turn invoked in visions in which Thekla appeared to him to confirm his royal legitimacy. This in turn is possible because she could also be considered an Isaurian woman, and of course a woman from the highest social circles who was related to a royal family at the end of her life. I am not sure whether I have already covered all dimensions of a possible virtual Thekla that is then tangible today. Be it as it may, the symbol of Thekla is by no means unambiguous. It can and could be used in very different ways. In fact, some dimensions of the remembered Thekla, example given her radical break with social conventions and her apostolate, fell more and more into oblivion and were even deliberately suppressed in later sources. Against this background, the question arises as to which of these dimensions the depiction of Thekla in the Capella Palatina seeks to express. When we look at the image, we notice that she is wearing a head covering that conceals her hair and thus hides an aspect of her femininity that is also considered problematic in the most important Thekla traditions. At the same time, she is not depicted in poor clothing, but in richly decorated garments, for example, with an elaborate border. In her clothes, the colors green and brown dominate. She wears a long dark green multi-pleated undergarment with her shoes only partially visible. The position of her hands in front of her body is striking. With her right hand, she makes, as far as I understand, the horns gesture, her hand resting near her heart. The symbolism of this striking gesture is not entirely clear. I was talking with several art historians, and the final point was, what I understood is that she as a woman is not allowed to give a blessing, so she has to give another side of her hand. In southern Italy and middle Italy, and I hope that the art historians will not completely destroy me now, this is possible that a figure has this kind of horn, which has also an apotropaic function. But maybe it could also be a special emphasis on the worship of God with a heart. But please tell me if this is completely nonsense. In any case, both fit Thekla, the servant of God, so a worshipper with a heart, and a miracle worker who defeats satanic forces. At first glance, this creates the impression of a combination of elements. The figure depicted here is an ascetic from a noble family, the leader of a monastic community that stands for an unusual form of worship and perhaps also for special powers to ward off evil. Is it a coincidence? Oh, sorry, this was my text here. Is it a coincidence that Thekla is depicted under the medallion of Sancta Spes, the personified virtue of hope? I am not sure how to make this connection. First, I tried to find any kinds of connections. It is unclear whether Thekla should simply be considered in relation to hope or whether there could be a larger context. If we try to put her in relation to hope, we could of course ask, to what extent can Thekla and hope be linked in such a way that hope can be associated with a specific aspect of a remembered Thekla? Of course, we could think about the idea that she is a proto-martyr who got God's help in almost hopeless situations. A proto-martyr who survived both martyrdoms because of God's miraculous intervention. Yes and no, but the depiction of Thekla here is a depiction which doesn't show any signs that she should be understood as a martyr. We have depictions of Thekla where she is described as a martyr, for example, as standing in fire in the paintings of the Exodus Chapel of El Bhagavat in Egypt, where I didn't get a good photo, or the glass medallions presented by Claudia Nauert and Rüdiger Warns, or the medallions where she is depicted with lions. Nor there is no idea in this depiction, as far as I see, that her survival, especially of the second martyrdom, is to be seen as a proof of the future resurrection from the dead. One could make other connections, but I would like to go on and come to different idea maybe. Maybe the combination of images allows for various associations, and this is all the more true when Thekla itself can be linked to different ideas in the Encyclopedia of the Führer, or remain a largely empty figure of female holiness. Maybe we could also go into this direction. The less concrete memory of Thekla is evoked, the more important Sancta Spes may become. In this case, the depiction can also be read in a very simple way. The status of sanctity includes the fundamental virtues, in this, the virtue of hope. Now to Radicundis. The combination of Thekla and Radicundis in turn invites comparison. The two saints form the center of a row of four, in which from the left to right, Margareta, Radicundis, Thekla, and Scholastica follow each other. The decisive connection between all of them is likely to be found in the motive of virginity, which from a medieval perspective maybe also can be formulated as monastic life. In addition, some of them have the special status of martyrs, Thekla, Margaret of Antioch in Pisidia, and the only one exception is Scholastica. In this combination, Radicundis is especially interesting. In her case, too, several motives can be identified that reveal particularly close connections with Thekla. I can only proceed in a sketchy manner. My main source of reference is the Vita Sancti Radicundis by Venantius Fortunatus, late 6th century, who was probably the most influential writer on Radicundis, and who knew Radicundis during her lifetime. He wrote shortly after the saint's death. In addition, there is another Vita of the saint, produced by the otherwise unknown nun Baldovinia, which is much less well known. I could only check it a little bit, and I will go for the publication deeper, and several mentioned in the work of Gregory of Tours, and in some manuscript of the Golden Legend, which is too late. I will focus primarily on Venantius Fortunatus. First, in the prologue of the Vita, Radigundi's precarious femininity is particularly emphasized, very similar to what we find with Thekla. Already in the very first sentence, he mentions that the Savior, I quote, celebrates mighty victories in the female gender and honors even physically weak women through the strength of an inglorious spirit. In fact, the motive of Radigundi's physical weakness, promoted through extreme asceticism, which precisely for this reason becomes proof of her inner strength, pervades the entire text in many variations. I think this is a leitmotif. A typical example can be found in paragraph 5, where it is recounted that after a night in a penitential garment, she is completely frozen through. We read, almost dead in the flesh, she did not care about the torments of the body, and with her mind fixed on paradise, considered what she endured to be light, though that she would not become worthless to Christ. Second, right from the beginning of the actual Vita, Radigundi's royal origins are emphasized. She comes from a Thuringian royal family, but as a child she is carried off as a booty by King Clothar I to the Merovingian Empire during a devastating Frankish raid on her homeland. But even when Clothar, a person known as extremely cruel, even in terms of his time, wants to take her to him, she tries to escape him, and above all the pomp and circumstances that goes with royal status. As paragraph 3 emphasizes, she is married to an earthly ruler, but in all her actions she shows her sole allegiance to Christ. The combination of royal status and a self-sacrificing attitude towards others is particularly beautifully described in paragraph 4. I quote, thus the pious woman, queen by birth and marriage, mistress of the court, served the poor as a maid. Number 3, the text never says that she is a virgin, but she is always related to virginity, and Clothar has his problems with that because she never wants to have sexual intercourse with him. Finally, she flees from him and wants to become a nun, but she is not made a nun first, only later. First, she is made a deacon, ordained a deacon by Bishop Medardus. Number 4, the text refers to her desire to become a martyr, which is also quite interesting. But she cannot become a martyr because there is no persecution of Christianity anymore. Nevertheless, the text constructs Radegundis as a martyr in several places. This is already hinted at in paragraph 21, where she is described not only as a confessor but also as a martyr because of her extraordinary virtues, and is specifically elaborated. This is specifically elaborated in paragraph 26. There she inflicts burning iron on herself as her own torturer, and she tries to set herself on fire. And so almost the same martyrdom she wants to achieve like Thekla. An act which is interpreted with the words, and she pursued her martyrdom of her own accord since the time of persecution was over. Number 5, she is a prudent woman. She is a learner, not a teacher anymore. Number 6, and a recurring motive in Radegundi's Vita is the saint's extraordinary care for the poor and needy. This is not limited to the distribution of food and drink. There are striking references to Radegundi's washing the poor and caring for their wounds. She is understood as a new martyr who does not shy away from disgusting tasks. She even cares for lepers, aware of the risk of infection, etc., etc. 7, she is developed into a model of extreme asceticism, which basically renounces and rejects everything that her status would allow her. This is particularly evident in the fact that she often wears penitential garments and rejects all outward signs of royal status. Her extreme fasting is repeatedly emphasized, which she maintains even at lavishly laid tables without the other guests noticing. In addition, she repeatedly subjects herself to physical punishment, so she binds herself with iron chains that cut deep into her flesh or burns the signs of Christ into her body. 8. She is also a miracle worker compared to the miracles of Jesus and to the miracles of Martin of Tours. The funniest miracle, just for a minute, there's even in small details miracles. The great glory of God is also in the smallest things. Once, when a ball of wool that the saint had wound was hanging from the ceiling of the room, a mouse wanted to tamper with it. So we would think that she does something nice with a mouse, but before the mouse could cut the thread, it remained hanging dead in the middle of its bite. The poor animal, dead and yet immortal, as part of the story, one might say. So, even this brief sketch is revealing. At least the Radicundis of Venantius Fortunatus, in her rebellion against a forced marriage, her renunciation of her status, and her chosen ascetic lifestyle, the goal of which is to live uncompromisingly against all resistance, including martyrdom, in order to attain a heavenly life, is remarkably reminiscent of Thekla, or the female figures developed on the model of Thekla, some of which also served as deaconesses. One could speak of a kind of a Thekla reloaded in the Merovingian Frankish Empire. The exciting thing for our question is, in Palermo, we encounter practically nothing of this. Here we find not a Radicundis who pushes herself to the brink of self-mutilation and mortifies herself to the extreme, but a saint in the garb of a Byzantine ruler. Maybe it's not the point that she is described here as a Byzantine ruler, but the crucial point is that the portrayal not only omits the most important elements of the text or the texts, like her extreme asceticism, but also essentially reverses the key message of Venantius Vita. This Radicundis does not renounce her royal status, but combines kingship and holiness. This naturally allows for some dimensions of her holiness that are appropriate for a princess, including, in particular, her care for the poor, but hardly it includes her downright aggressive turning away from the ruler, who is also her husband. This is complemented by another element, namely Radicundis' association with Sancta Fides. Of course, Radicundis may represent an unshakable faith in Christ, but this association is absolutely anything but specific. It would be more fitting for a saint like her to have a leitmotif associated with the virtue of caritas, she the one who is caring for the poor. As with Thekla, the specific combination seems difficult to explain if one wants to explain it in terms of Radicundis as a symbolic figure. All this allows for a cautious conclusion. Thekla and Radicundis can both be interpreted as symbolic figures on many levels. The elements that can be associated with them, at least in the texts that tell their stories, are so similar in some aspects that Radicundis could almost be understood as a kind of a new Thekla for the Frankish Empire of the Merovingian period. In the Cappella Palatina, they stand side by side, creating a contrast between the two that is particularly exciting because the posture and facial expressions of both figures are very similar. Contrary to the corresponding textual evidence, which describes their status as endangered, precarious, both these depictions emphasize their basically high status. Radicundis is a saint as queen. Thekla is an ascetic and possibly wise teacher. She continues to be a woman whose clothing suggests a high status. At the same time, the depiction in the Cappella Palatina obscures crucial points that are associated with both the remembered Thekla and the remembered Radicundis. Above all, the radical nature of both women's lives, which is evident in the text, is not apparent here, at least from my side. Both renounce partnership to a husband, and with this their inherited status and all its privileges. They took extreme risks, even to the point of martyrdom, and they faced the precariousness of their femininity. In the Cappella Palatina, they are placed in a series of 4 holy women, all of whom represent aspects of monastic life. Assigned to them are 4 smaller medallions depicting St. Anastasia and personifications of the virtues of faith, hope, and love. My initial impulse to establish a concrete connection between the virtue depicted above each saint and the saint herself led me maybe astray, in my opinion. At the very least, the association between Fides and Radicundis is so tenuous that no specific relationship can be discerned. However, this fits in with the rest of my observations. Precisely because they are deprived of the radical elements associated with the memory of them, at least the ancient memory, the women saints can be linked to the very fundamental virtues of faith, hope, and love and hope, which are at the same time very broad in terms of content. Maybe even the question whether Anastasia really stands for the martyr from Sirmium or is meant to remind us of Anastasis' resurrection can remain open. Presented in this way, the 4 women saints of this row, as women of high status, can also become role models for the women for whom the Capella Palatina, at least as I understand, is intended. Women of the Norman court. They are presented with an ideal of holiness that has little to do with the radical narratives of the Acts of Thekla or the Vita of Venantius Fortunatus. An ideal of holiness that can be approached without too much risk by women of the upper class who adhere to the basic Christian virtues. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tobias, for this amazing paper, and I really think that the floor is open and we have the first question.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tobias. That was very interesting and fascinating to me. Just a short observation and then perhaps also a question. What is interesting with the mosaics of Capella Palatina is, and you have shown that now with regard to these female figures as well, is that these aspects of suffering and martyrdom are omitted. That is the same with Peter and Paul. So, for example, the presentation of Peter is focused on his healings, but his crucifixion is not depicted. So, and it is the victory of Peter and Paul about Simon Magus, for example. So that is present in the mosaics, but not their suffering or martyrdom or any problems that they might have had. And so that's just an observation, and I think one can perhaps apply that to several of the stories that are told by the mosaics in the Capella Palatina. And the question is whether we can interpret that in the history of the 12th century, so when these mosaics were made. So perhaps it shows, the mosaics show that these famous Christian figures are successful and they are glorious figures and they do not suffer for anything, but that aspect that they have success in what they are doing seems to be a quite prominent feature of these mosaics, and perhaps it has something to do with the history of Sicily in the 11th and 12th century. So it's just a remark, and perhaps you can say something to that.
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting observation, and I hope that so there are many people here who know the Capella Palatina much better than me. So that means I don't have the overview of this. I saw a depiction of Peter, the crucified Peter, in the Cathedral of Monreale, if I'm not wrong. So maybe this is not everywhere in the same way present, this martyrdom and lack of martyrdom, but maybe it is, of course, an idea to say if this is a chapel of glory, where glory is so important, then, of course, even the glory of the martyrs is something which only is seen in its final result. So this is the little speculation which I would try to make, and then would like to have the points which could be made by the experts. At least for me, at a certain point, I had the feeling this is an almost emptied Tekla. So after all what I have done about Tekla and all my associations, of course focusing on late antiquity, this is a very different one. And the same with Radicundis, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I am fascinated by your proposal that these are royal models, but set apart from the exercise of supreme power. Mm-hmm. I mean, they are, for example, the Cappella Palatina lacks Santa Theodora or Eudokia, so not empresses, but they underline the aristocratic status better. Mm-hmm. As for the gesture of Tekla, I don't know if I missed it in your speech, but could it be the sign of eloquence? Because it is a test.
Yeah, it was this sign, I think it is here.
Yeah, I mean, the thumb is clearly visible.
Okay.
But it could be that the middle fingers are juncted with the thumb. And so it is, I mean, for example, the Pantocrator in Daphne has it, and also in manuscripts. So, and it could be hinting to the antique tradition of eloquence, Quintilianus and so on. And so, as for the preaching, I mean.
This would be especially interesting. Though this was the point where I had most of the difficulties. I talked to several people also who are interested in Orthodox iconography and so, because I thought this may be something coming from Byzantine background and so on, and I got very, very different answers from them. And the final and longest answer was by someone who works on Orthodox thing, also in the Balkans and so on, and he said number one was she is not allowed to give a blessing, and he thought this could be something apotropaic. But this explanation is something which I would prefer, because it would fit much more to her. There could, of course, this could be even more emphasized, because, as far as I understand, there are in the Balkans depictions where she has a book in her hands, even, which would make the eloquence much better. So she is not the teacher like in these parallels. But the eloquence is something which I would like to have there very much. So we can, yeah. So I think this is something where I have to do a very long footnote and maybe a few more discussions. Thank you so much.
Any other question or comment? So if I may, you were underlying a lot, and correctly, this, female sanctity as a model. And so what about if you had the chance to make a comparison with the depiction of male sanctity in the chapel? If there are, maybe it's not an interesting point. But
no, this is a very interesting point, but I don't know whether I'm able to answer this, because I think we first also have to wait for what Jan is doing, because there are two aspects, two rows of female sanctity, and then there is a whole depiction of all the other things. Okay. So I think this is a question we should ask in the afternoon, when we have heard about Paul and Peter and so on, I think it's something for the overall overall complex.
We will keep that for the after.
Yeah, I'm quite sure that there is something to be said about that, but because I think this is could be one of the major theses which we can find out after that, when we bring all together all the facets and fragments we can deliver today.
Perfect. So thank you again. Okay. And Jan, please. Okay. So it's my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Jan Bremmer from University of Groningen. So I don't think that he needs very much explanation about his activity and scientific production. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emanuela. It's the same as me. I'm not an art historian. I haven't even had the chance to visit the Capella, so the art historical part comes very short. But like Tobias, I hope to do a bit more in the printed version. Now, with the two female martyrs of our title, we will meet two women whose fate in the tradition has been rather different. While Perpetua's martyrdom is well documented in early sources, Euphemia is barely mentioned in our early tradition. But whereas Perpetua is rarely honored by churches, and that only in the West, Euphemia's fame spread both in the East and West. This made her the more famous martyr of the two, with many churches being named after her. But how did these two saints end up in Sicily? This is a difficult question to answer, as we will see, but we will attempt to do so. Let us start with Perpetua, who is probably the more famous saint at present. How would people have heard about Perpetua? The most plausible explanation is that they had read about her in the account of her martyrdom. However, there are several accounts of this event which have not always received equal attention. The most famous account is, to judge by modern studies, the Passio Perpetuae. And indeed, starting from the 2012, the 2012 collective volume on the Passio, which encapsulated and improved the extant knowledge, a tsunami of publications ensued, also often more in the nature of restating known facts rather than offering new insights. There have been 2 new translations, 2 new critical editions, a student edition, 2 studies of the text, of the Latin text, 3 monographs, 3 studies of its reception in the early Church and Middle Ages, a huge number of articles, and even a graphic history. Moreover, 2 recent articles have refuted the recent fanciful dating of the Passio to the time of Cyprian or even to 400 AD. There can be little doubt that the martyrdom itself took place on March 7 in the year 203, and that the Passio was published only a few years later by an anonymous editor who utilized a diary kept by Perpetua herself and an account of her vision by her spiritual guru, Saturus. It still remains uncertain to what extent the editor embellished his account. Nevertheless, there can be no doubt that he did so. This is evident from his adaptation of Perpetua's behavior to align with a famous scene from Euripides' tragedy, the Hecuba. After being tossed by a cow, Perpetua fell onto her side and then pulled her attire straight in order to cover her size. However, this gesture emulated that of the Trojan heroine Polyxena, who, when killed by Pyrrhus, fell to the ground and, according to Euripides, concealing for male eyes what had to be concealed. This gesture was very well known in Jewish, Latin, and Greek literature from the first 2 centuries of the Christian era, suggesting a certain level of the editor's education. But if he lacks reliability in this case, what about other cases? The editor recounts conversations with the martyrs just before their deaths, despite them being located at different gates, which is highly improbable. Additionally, the portrayal of Perpetua as essentially killing herself is noteworthy. Like Polyxena in the Hecuba, she displayed great courage in the face of her executioner, and even trumped Polyxena in death by guiding the nervous gladiator's hand to her throat. This embellishment by the editor has not been sufficiently taken into account when studying another version of the martyrdom. Before turning to that one, however, let us first make a few observations on the Greek translation of the Passio. Although the Greek translation of the Passio has been known since its discovery in a 10th or 11th manuscript in Jerusalem in 1889 by Randall Harris, it is only in the last decade that the text itself and its context have received sustained attention in two excellent articles. One, by Clementina Mazzucco, focuses on the nature of the text, and the other, by Brent Shaw, examines its seats in Leben and reception. These studies have made it crystal clear that the Greek version is a relatively late translation, probably dating from the 6th century, yet derived from a superior text compared to that of our best Latin manuscript, the 11th century Codex Casinensis. Mazzucco's careful and detailed analysis of the text should be applied to a new edition of the Latin version, but that is beyond the scope of this discussion. What is striking is that the Greek translation shares several notable details with the so-called Acta Perpetuae A, a shorter version of the Passio, whose precise date remains a matter of debate. Let us therefore turn to that intricate problem. The recent discussion by Brent Shaw concludes as follows. The concatenation of shared differences and similarities suggests that the author of the Latin A Acta somehow had information shared by the Greek version that contained accurate data not found in the Latin Passio, and that they also shared the same omissions found in it. The most obvious conclusion is that both versions stem from an earlier and superior state of the Latin text than that represented by the Codex Casinensis. Shaw dates the Greek version and Acta A to late antiquity, but Eric Rubilar is even more precise and argues that Acta A derived its listing of the martyrs in the order of Satyrus, Saturninus, Revocatus, Felicitas, and Perpetua from the Liber Genealogus of 427. However, it's difficult to understand why the author of Acta A would have based his order on that specific book, but nothing else in his account, as is actually the case. Indeed, it's Indeed, it seems more plausible that the author of the Liber derived his order from the Acta A. It is true that the Acta A is not cited by Augustine or other 5th century North African clergymen, but why should they, when they also had the full text of the Passio at their disposal? Now, by analyzing the vocabulary of martyrdom, the Dutch patristic scholar Harry Hoppenbrouwers, I couldn't find a photo of him on Google Images, but I did find his death announcement, which for those who can read Dutch, the few of you might be interesting. But the Dutch patristic scholar Harry Hoppenbrouwers concluded that in his dissertation of the early 1960s, il semble bien que Acta A est contemporain, ou peu s'en faut, de la Passio et des premiers ouvrages de Tertullien. This assertion cannot be wholly correct, as the Acta A begins with Facta itaque persecutione sub Valeriano et Gallieno, and the same date is given by the Greek version at its very beginning. Therefore, these versions must be later than the mentioned persecution, which took place in 258 till 260. However, there's a real difference between the Latin Greek version and Acta A when we take a closer look at its mention of obligatory sacrifice. In the Passio, Perpetua is ordered to sacrifice, I quote, for the health of the emperors, a directive which she declines, of course, as this is the sole occurrence of an obligatory sacrifice in the Passio. In Acta A, however, the proconsul Menicius instructs the future martyrs, I quote, sacrifice to the gods, for thus the eternal emperors, perpetui principes, have commanded it. After they all had refused to sacrifice, the proconsuls separated the men from the women and again ordered Satyrus and the other males to sacrifice, which they again refused to do so. Now, this section is not present in the Passio, but it seems to reflect to some extent the aftermath of the persecutions of Valerian and Gallienus. First, there was no edict to sacrifice at the time of Perpetua, but this was of course different with the reigns of Valerian and Gallienus, whose edict to sacrifice is very well known. Second, the formula Perpetuus Imperator is not documented before the Emperor Aurelian. In other words, the author of Acta A must have written hardly much earlier than 270, but given the observation of Hoppenbrouwers, not too long afterwards either. In fact, we know that the Passio drew much attention around the time of Valerian, as is evidenced by its notable influence on both the contemporary Passion of Lucius and Montanus and the Passion of Marian and James. And the Vita Cipriani of Pontius even clearly polemicizes against it. However, this adaptation of the text to the time of writing does not mean that the passage in question and the subsequent one on the interrogation of Felicitas were later inventions of the author of Acta A. This would suggest that somebody, approximately 2 centuries later, would have fabricated these scenes, inserted the mention of the imperial edict, and even remembered that Minutius was a proconsul who had died while the martyrs were imprisoned and undergoing trial. That seems rather implausible. Conversely, the Passio's editor exclusive focus on Perpetua and Satyrus easily explains why he omitted these scenes. If we accept his premise and consider the embellishment of the death of Perpetua by the editor, the matter-of-fact description of the death of the martyrs in Acta A seems more believable than that presented in the Passio. Now, in the beginning of Acta A, it is mentioned that the catechumens were arrested, I quote, apud Africam in civitate turbitanorum. Surely it would be odd if the author mentioned Africa if this writing was intended for a readership in Carthage and environ. They knew that Turbobominus was located in Africa. It must mean that he composed his account for people outside Africa, presumably in response to inquiries regarding the events during the recent persecutions. In fact, it seems to me that the dramatic nature of the Passio has always led scholars to favor that version of the martyrdom. By contrast, the much more sober version of the events in Acta A is less appealing from a literary point of view, but more believable from a historical perspective. Therefore, I assume that more material about the end of the group around Satyrus and Perpetua was available in the 3rd century than in later periods. However, by the time of the Greek translation, the Passio had become the preferred version in Africa. This preference might also be a contributing factor to the absence of any reference to the Acta A by Augustine and his contemporaries. It probably was not very much available in North Africa. The fact that this version is in Latin indicates that the intended audience was also Latin-speaking. This suggests that the text was potentially transmitted to Gaul, Spain, and/or Italy. Of these possibilities, Perpetua is alluded to in Victricius of Rohan's brief sermon on the occasion of the ingressio of the relics of Euphemia and other saints into his newly built church. In De Laude Sanctorum, his short homily, in which he mentions percussor tremit, et trementis dexteram moriturus adjuvit. So the executioner is trembling, and he who is going to die is helping his right hand, which is exactly what happens actually in the Passio's description of Perpetua. In Spain, Perpetua's dream of her ascent to heaven, which is described both in the Passio and Acta A, already occurs on a 4th century Christian sarcophagus from Quantanaburba, some 40 kilometers northeast of Burgos. However, mention of Perpetua otherwise seems to appear quite late and only in the more northern ecclesiastical calendars. Finally, in Italy, Aquileia had early contact with Africa, even having an African bishop in the middle of the 4th century, but Perpetua and Felicitas are certainly commemorated in the Depositio Martyrum, the earliest surviving calendar of the Roman Church. At this point, though, no further textual evidence is currently available. We can only say that the earliest manuscripts of Acta A, dating from the 9th and 10th century, predate those of the Passio, but are not found in Italy, but rather in Germany and France. On the other hand, the oldest surviving manuscript of the Passio does not precede the 10th century, and the Codex Casinensis, our most complete manuscript of the Passio, is only from the late 11th century, although it seems to display some South Italian influence. At that time, Perpetua will have been well known in the region, as her name appears in Napolitan and other South Italian church calendars. With regards to text, the Codex Casinensis is the manuscript closest in time to the reign of Roger II, but it will hardly be the source for the representation of Perpetua in the Capella. However, before exploring other sources, let us first take a look at our second saint. While we have a detailed, virtually contemporaneous account of Perpetua's martyrdom, the sources about Euphemia are rather late and difficult to reconcile with one another. At the already mentioned occasion of the ingresio of the relics of her and other saints, our earliest source, Victricius of Rouen, so the end of the 4th century, refers to, I quote, Euphemia, who once, her soul made masculine, though a virgin, did not pale before the executioner. The notice is not very informative, but it appears that according to Victricius, Euphemia had been beheaded, as the percussor was often called decolator, so the beheader. From the context, it is clear that the relics had already been present in Rouen. However, the mention of Gervasius and Protasius suggests a date around 386, when their relics were discovered by Ambrosius. In any case, the earliest mention of Euphemia dates to around 384, when Egeria visited her church in Chalcedon, which he calls most famous and long known to me. The church was indeed famous enough for the Emperor Arcadius to meet the Gothic leader Gainas in the Martyrion in 400, there where the body of the martyr Euphemia lies, according to the church historian Socrates. The reason of his fame is obscure, but it will explain the fact that Euphemia is one of the earliest Eastern saints whose relics were exported to the West. The fame may also explain why in the West we only learn of her origins in the poems of Paulinus of Nola, again around 400. However, at more or less the same time, we gain an entirely different impression of Euphemia's martyrdom from a brief sermon, if not rather a rhetorical exercise, by Asterius of Amazeia, plausibly dating from around 400. In it, Asterius describes a series of panels in a church which must have been outside the city that purport to depict the trial and execution of Euphemia. We subsequently see her in front of the judge being tortured by having her teeth extracted with hammer and drill, sitting in prison with the sign of the cross appearing above her head, and finally standing in the midst of a great fire with her hands extended towards heaven. As has been seen repeatedly, There can be no doubt that Asterius' description was meant to elicit full empathy with the fate of the Virgin Martyr by focusing on the emotional intensity of the scenes. Now, there has been a long debate about whether Asterius is describing a real set of paintings or simply giving us a proof of his consummate rhetorical powers. This is not an easily answered question, and the opinions of scholars have been divided. It is somewhat odd, I would say, that Asterius does not mention in which city he saw these paintings, nor mention anything about the time of her execution. In fact, Euphemia's time seems pretty certain, as the Fasti Vindobonensis Prioris, beginning of the 5th century, mentions for the year 300, during the consulate of Diocletian for the 7th time, and Maximinian for the 5th time, Ecclesiae demoluti sunt et libri dominici combusti. So the books have been burned. Et passa est Sancta Euphemia on the 16th of September. The date 303 is important, as Diocletian's first edict was directed at members of the upper classes. This suggests that Euphemia was one of those, even though we do not know that much about the elite families of Chalcedon. Yet, of all the cities of the coastal area of Asia Minor, from Pontus to Ionia, the name Euphemia is attested most actually in Chalcedon. However, at this earliest stage of the persecutions, those who refused to sacrifice were still beheaded rather than terribly tortured and burnt at the stake. That makes the nature of Euphemia's execution in the painting rather implausible. Asterius' praise of the paintings also seems rather over the top, but that could of course be a case of rhetorical exaggeration. More importantly, it seems to me, is the fact that there are only very few examples of early church paintings. In an important study, the Flemish scholar Johan Leemans can mention only 3 of them in the 4th century. One by Gregory of Nyssa in his homily on the recruit Theodore, and 2 by Asterius himself, who was a great admirer of Gregory, and who may well have been inspired by him or have tried to emulate him. Strangely, in this debate, nobody seems to have observed that Asterius also alludes to his description of a painting in a presumably local church of Phocas, although without any detail. Finally, we have no proof that he ever went to Chalcedon, nor does anybody else mention the set of paintings either. Not Egeria, who must have visited the church around the time of Asterius' account, not Evagrius, despite his detailed description of the church, and not any notice from the Council of Chalcedon. A healthy skepticism seems warranted in this case, even though Asterius' piece would still play an important role in the discussion about icons at the Second Council of Nicaea. This brings us to our final major source, the epic Passion, which was written around the time of the famous Council of Chalcedon in 451, or possibly even a bit later. The Passion recounts how the proconsul Priscus, evidently an invented name, orders the inhabitants of Chalcedon to sacrifice to the god Ares at a specific time. When it appears that Euphemia and others have failed to do so, they are arrested. Naturally, Euphemia refuses to sacrifice. After several interrogations and various forms of tortures, such as being broken on the wheel, excruciated in a stove, and mutilated by stones, she finally dies at the hands of a wild animal in the arena. There can be no doubt that this is a highly embellished account. Admittedly, the French historian Valéry Pont, a very good historian by the way, has argued that the order for the whole population to sacrifice dates the death of Euphemia to 304 or even 309. But that seems implausible. But it is of course not impossible that the author had knowledge of such an order. In this case, it clearly serves a literary purpose, to depict Euphemia and her fellow faithful as the only ones to refuse it. As nothing else in the Passion comes even close to a historical fact, there are also a lot of allusions to Thekla, it is improbable to claim just this one detail as a remnant of an older account, which is of course no longer available. Still, the Passion contributed to the fame of the saint, as it was translated into Latin at probably an early stage, given that Anodius, who died in 521, is already familiar with all the tortures described in the Passion. With these sources, we have exhausted the earliest evidence, which shows that Euphemia had become well known both in the East and West very early on. The reason for this fame, as said, is not clear. However, it's more likely that she received this fame because she was one of the earliest martyrs than if she had been martyred much later in the Diocletian persecutions, when the number of victims must have increased considerably. Be that as it may, it is clear that the fame of Euphemia grew over time, especially after the Council of Chalcedon. We hear of her relics in Algeria in 474, and she is referenced in the Sacramentarium Veronense and other early Latin sacramentaria. Churches connected to her name soon appeared in the East, in places as far apart as Constantinople, to which her relics were transferred during the reign of Constantine IV, Jerusalem, and Egyptian Oxyrhynchus. While in the West, we find early Euphemia churches in Grado, in Rome, and even 4, if we include monasteries, in Ravenna. Last but not least, a church dedicated to Euphemia is mentioned in Sicily in the second half of the 8th century. By the time of Roger II, both Perpetua and Euphemia were well-known saints with fixed days on the church calendar, the 7th of March and the 16th of September, respectively. However, the place of martyrs in the church was not always the same. There's a clear development in which the martyrs gradually lost importance. This can be well illustrated with the Euphemia church in Rome, dating from the 7th or even 5th century, where ancient drawings show that the martyr occupied the central place in the apse. Here she was depicted with her arms raised in the posture of an orant standing between 2 snakes, perhaps representing one of the tortures she endured for refusing to worship the statue of Ares, but according to others, representing heresies. However, after the 8th century, the martyrs lost their central positions in the apse, which became now occupied by Christ or by Mary. This development coincided with the gradual disappearance of martyria. Therefore, let us now turn to the martyrs in the church, but not in the central apse as in the Capella. In a persuasive article, the Swiss art historian Beat Brenk has argued that the mosaics of the Capella were created relatively quickly in the 1140s according to a master plan. If this is true, as it may well be, this suggests that the designer of the mosaics will have been inspired by similar works. However, it is remarkable, or at least noteworthy, that no local saints, whether from Sicily itself or from southern Italy, were chosen. It is not if there was no choice in this respect. On the contrary, there were plenty of local saints, some of whom even date back to early Christian Sicily, such as Saint Agatha or Saint Euplus. As we have no idea who was actually responsible for the final choice of saints or their arrangement, we can only guess. Now it seems reasonable to suppose that the mosaicists and their designer, who appear to have been of Greek origin, had looked around to view other church mosaics. It seems important to observe in this context that relatively early Christian churches already had depicted groups of both female and male martyrs. We are fortunate in that both Anne-Marie Jason and Annewies van der Hoek, apparently independent from one another, have collected and compared the relevant material by examining churches in Croatian Poreč, Ravenna, Rome and Thessaloniki. They both note the influence of the Eucharistic prayers with their mention of various saints and martyrs. They also note that these prayers with their collections of saints and martyrs meant that the churches were not restricted to depict local heroes, but also happily selected martyrs even from places as far apart as North Africa and Asia Minor. Thus, Perpetua and Euphemia can be seen already in the Archiepiscopal Chapel and San Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna and in Porridge in the early 6th century, with Euphemia in the leading position of the female martyrs, but also among those mentioned by the Sacramentarium Veronense. Given their place in these brilliant churches, it can hardly be a surprise that these martyrs also feature in the Capella. However, the lack of information regarding the design and development of the Capella with regard to the martyrs means that ultimately we can only offer this somewhat unsatisfactory answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, for this very detailed paper on sources, and this is really what we are looking for, to try to find sources to understand something, even if it's really difficult sometimes. So the floor is open, and questions or answers, or to the question that Professor Jan Bremmer did.
I'm glad to see I'm so convincing.
So I was wondering if I may just to start, because so there is again this kind of element in this chapel in which you were mentioning, so sources in which tortures about martyrdom, and so we don't see anything of this in this chapel. So again, as we were saying that yesterday about the end of time and the non-depiction of the end of time, again here we have another element in this sense, I would say, no depiction of martyrdom, torture. So we have this glory at least this main topic is the glory of saint, and then the glory of God, of course, as the main topic of the chapel. So could be a link, I mean, this kind of depiction of saints and the choice of non-depicting tortures, eschatology, end of time. I don't know.
That's very hard to answer, but you get the feeling a bit that the aspects of martyrdom have really, in a way, faded away. The most important thing is they are famous saints. I think because the court of Roger was, of course, extremely international, that may have been one of the reasons that they went for very well-known saints and not just ones who were only locally known, because they clearly, these are saints which are mentioned in very early martyrologies, had churches in many other places. So people, when they walked into the saint in the church, they wouldn't have to think, gosh, Agatha, who's that? But it says Euphemia, Perpetua, Thecla. These are really the stars, so to speak, of early Christianity.
Tobias, one moment, we need a microphone for Tobias Nicklas.
Thank you very much. This was, of course, very, very convincing with so many details, and I have to think, especially also about Euphemia, which I had not really known about the background and so on.
Neither did I till a month ago.
The major point is, would all this fit into this idea, which I understood also from yesterday, that this is a place for a kind of a universal idea of royalty? Is this an aspect or for this, or is this going too far?
I think that would fit. Yeah. On the other hand, I was surprised how little we know actually about the people behind all these mosaics. Of course, I'm not a specialist, and I would agree with Jens that somehow we should place it in the 12th century. But yeah, one arrives at the limits of one's knowledge when working. But
I think it would be quite important to put the mosaic programs together. So there are several of these mosaic programs in the chapel, so in a vertical and in a horizontal line. And I think it is quite important to incorporate them together, because there were several motifs selected from the biblical stories and also from non-biblical figures and episodes. And I think it makes sense from the perspective of that 12th century chapel that was then consecrated by Roger II and so on. And I think that would be quite interesting from the reception perspective. So why were these figures selected, and how they were presented? So what is depicted and what is also left out? So this is quite interesting. Sorry.
No, if I can jump on this, I mean, it is clear to me that there is a kind of royal rhetoric that is applied. So if we should choose a way to read everything, it is through this lens of a royal rhetoric that we can try to give element to this together. So thank you again, and we are going, okay, in Italian we would say dalla regia. Okay, we have our break now, but before that we are invited to visit the museum, and especially this room, and that it's rich of art crafts that you can see and visit. So before we have the visit, and then we go down for the break and see you at 10:45. In our second part of this morning, with the paper given by Caterina Moro, Professor Caterina Moro. She's teaching in Rome, Hebrew language and Jewish literature at Roma Tre in university, and the floor is yours.
Passo la presentazione. Voi vedete in visualità loro?
Sì,
okay. All right. Yeah. Good morning. First of all, I want to thank my colleague and friend Emanuela Valeriani for inviting me to this meeting. When she did so, I proposed the paper on Moses tradition, because it's my favorite argument, ignoring back then that it's not so easy to find Moses among the mosaic of the Palatin chapel. There are no stories of Moses in Cappella Palatina. He is represented only as a witness of the transfiguration of Jesus. You see on the right, this is Moses, there is the name in Greek, or among the prophets in the mosaics of the dome around the Pantocrator, Jesus Christ Pantocrator. As you can see in both cases, he is treated like an ageless figure. He is beardless and young, with long blonde hair. We will return on this at the end of my presentation. As the other prophets of the dome, Moses has a scroll in his hand with his prophecy. It is a quote of Exodus chapter 3, verse 2, the episode of the burning bush, or the burning bramble. It is a quote of Exodus, but does not correspond to the common text of the Septuagint. Kai eidon, kai e kaieto e batos, kai u kateflegeto. the text of the Septuagint is kai ora oti obatos kaieitai piuri odebatos u katekaieto. The meaning is similar, but there are omissions in the version of the scroll, and there are different diction, kate flegeto instead of kate kaieto. I didn't know what kind of textual affiliation has this kind of quote. Maybe it's not the quote of a father of the church, for example, but I don't know if it's an Antiochian text. I propose, I and Emanuela propose to make a little study about this kind of quotation in the Cappella Palatina to see what can we say about their textual affiliation. Coming to the main subject of this presentation, one of the many problems we have to face in the historical study of Scripture is that we cannot help reasoning in terms of biblical, even for periods where there was still no Bible, no fixed collection of selected book. For example, when we use the expression in biblical times, or when we put a paragraph called in the Bible when speaking of a phenomenon, death in the Bible, I don't know, women in the Bible, like it was something. The Bible was a physical object of a period, a historical period. That's simply not true. The books that now are part of the Bible circulated once as single rolls of papyrus or parchment, along with many other rolls whose content was not so different. The vast majority of text from the Qumran caves, for example, is para-biblical. That is something that looks a lot like the Bible, but it's not. In late Second Temple Judah, a para-biblical book like Jubilees claimed authority for itself and could be quoted as a scripture, for example, in the document of Damascus, and considered a source of halakha, legal interpretation. There are some 16 copies of Jubilees in the Qumran case. If the canon of sacred books as a whole is the final result of a process, the same can also be true for the biblical version of a narrative. So we can envision the story of Jewish origins narrated in the book of Exodus as the end point of a process which involved originally a cluster of tradition, each one with its peculiarities. In fact, some biblical passages also tell the story of Moses and the departure of the Jewish people from Egypt, or a part thereof, in a different way than the books of the Torah. For example, the first book of Samuel, chapter 12, verse 8, when Jacob came to Egypt and your forefathers cried out to the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, and they brought your forefathers out of Egypt, and they made them dwell in this place. The verb presupposes of this last part of the verse, they made them dwell in this place, presupposes that Moses and Aaron entered in Canaan and did not die before entering, as in Numbers 33 and Deuteronomy 34. In Psalm 78, Egypt is struck by different plagues than those reported in Exodus 7 to 12. This is the tradition of the plagues are different plagues. For example, in Psalm 78, there's no plague of the darkness, but there's a pestilence that strikes man, and maybe man, surely man, but also livestock, as in while in the Exodus tradition, in the Exodus tradition, you have also a pestilence of the livestock. This is important because the pestilence is a kind of thorn in the side of the Exodus tradition, because it was an argument used by non-Hebrew writer, also in anti-Judaic fashion. Other variant elements, on the other hand, have been preserved only outside the biblical canon, in the Jewish literature, in Greek, especially Artopanos, Flavius Josephus, but also Philo of Alexandria, the pseudepigrapha, such as Jubilees, the book of biblical antiquities, that will return often in this presentation, and the Assumption of Moses, and later Jewish and Samaritan literature, such as the Talmud, late antique and medieval commentaries. One of these elements that is not present in the Bible is the prophecy of the birth of a Savior. Before the birth of Moses, someone has a dream or a revelation about him and his role in the history of salvation. What is the function of a prediction of Moses' birth in the story? It is original to the story of Moses. Grassman believed in Moses und seine Zeit, but was a very old book, or it's secondary. I cannot tell if it's original, but it's quite ancient. Some form of prediction of Moses' birth could have been known to the author of this part of Exodus. Why? Because he decided that the correct form of Exodus chapter 1:22 was, and Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the Nile, and every daughter you shall allow to live. Mind this word, because the Septuaginta says, the antectes tois Hebraiois. Almost all the people who speaks about this passage thought these are the Hebrew children, but it's not. They are Hebrew and Egyptian alike. And it is also in the tradition, in the interpretive tradition, in the Midrash Tanhuma, a late antique commentary, the astrologoi had said to them, to the Egyptians, on this day the Redeemer of Israel shall be born, but we do not know whether he is an Egyptian or not. Is it Egyptian or Jewish? Moses is both Egyptian and Jew. So all the children had to be thrown in the Nile. In the current form of the story, this thing gives a powerful motivation to the Egyptian princess' behavior. At present, she cannot have a child because it would be killed in any case. And so the only way for her to elude her father's decree is to adopt a child who has already been thrown into the Nile, but survived. Here is a scheme of the different witnesses of this prophecy, the receiver of the prophecy and the text, the relevant text. You see, there are so many texts, I can't present them all, but I will try in the written form of this presentation. For example, is the scribe, a sacred scribe, a hierogrammateus of the Egyptian, or is a magician? For example, in the text I presented before, they are astrologoi, this is the Greek term. Or is Pharaoh themselves in a dream? It's a late form, but it is important because it's the nearest to some form of this story in non-Jewish text, as we will see. It is a form of prophecy that is present in the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, that is a Targum rich in Haggadah, rich in non-biblical tradition, and in the Chronicles of Moses, our teacher, that is a very late midrash, but maybe not so late, at least in some part of it. In this second slide, the prediction, the prophecy of some to family, not to Pharaoh, not to justify the behavior of the Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh kills the baby, baby Egyptian and Hebrew as in the Bible, or only Hebrew child. In the majority of the non-biblical witnesses are only Hebrew child, not Egyptian, like only the, well, this is another argument. This is the family. So Amram has a dream. We will see in Flavius Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jewish, or Miriam, his sister, because he is called Miriam the prophetess in Exodus 15. Why the prophetess? Because he prophesied the birth of the Savior. Say to his parent that their son will be the Savior of the Jews. And it is very old. It is in the book of Jewish Antiquities, a text, we have it only in Latin, but it's the Latin translation of a Greek translation of a Hebrew text. This is quite assured. In the Talmud, in the Midrashim, and in the Memar Marka, that is in a Samaritan text. And when some tradition appears in a Samaritan text and in a Jewish text, it means that it could be more ancient than the 2nd century before Christian era. The daughter, another form, minority form, is a prediction to the daughter of Pharaoh. So the daughter had a dream. The daughter of Pharaoh had a dream that she was going to adopt an exceptional child. The narrative of Flavius Josephus has both kinds of prophecy. Is a prophecy to Pharaoh and a prophecy to Amram. Moreover, is the dream of Amram, of the father of the hero, reproduced a very ancient narrative pattern. We have a story of this kind already in the Ugaritic material from the 14th century BC. A Canaanian version of this story. I don't think it's possible to establish what kind of prophecy is in the original version of the story, because I don't think it exists an original version. We have told of a cluster of traditions. But these stories of prophecies are not embroideries or later additions, because they are distributed not only in the stories of Moses in the Hebrew tradition, but also in parallel texts belonging to different languages and civilizations that follow the pattern of the hero, the story of the hero who was exposed at birth. Many history of the hero was exposed at birth. We can remember Romulus et Remus, Perseus, Cyrus the Great, Sargon of Akkad, the text from the first millennium BC that was found in the 19th century. This element corresponds to the prediction of the birth of the future king, often the grandson and future usurper of the reigning king. In the history of many of the exposed heroes, Oedipus, Heracles, Cyrus the Great, Perseus, and even Gilgamesh. There is a story of Gilgamesh in Helianus, in Greek, about this grandfather of Gilgamesh, who put his daughter in a tower, in order not to have an intercourse with someone and have a child, because there was a prophecy that his grandson would be the usurper of his throne. So it is highly probable that the prophecy of the birth of the Savior was part of the original cluster of traditions that we are trying to reconstruct, that preceded the writing of Exodus chapter 2 and 3 and survived it. Since this kind of narrative revolves around the idea of fate, of divine will that saves the hero to be when he is most weak and fragile, was born, a presage of future glory for the infant transforms it in an oracular story. This is a definition by David Owen, but I find it very useful. An oracular story is a story where an oracle is fulfilled thanks to the actions taken to avert it. So someone has an oracle that he don't want to be fulfilled, and then take an action that eventually is the action that that made the prophecy to be fulfilled. For example, the brothers of Joseph in the Joseph story in the Bible, they sell that brother, and so it became really the leading man of his dreams. Moses' birth story was from the onset the result of a deliberate manipulation of the pattern, the tail type of the hero who was exposed at birth. It's not in his original form, because in the biblical story, Moses is not adopted by a commoner, by a shepherd or a gardener, as in other stories, but by a princess, and a princess that is also heir to the throne. And the hero's change his ethnic identity. Moses' birth story with the prophecy becomes involved in the evolution of concept of providence. Providence will save the righteous, the faithful one, notwithstanding all the efforts of the wicked. In Philo, this idea is one of the meaning of the episode of the burning bush. The meaning of the burning bush in Philo, one of the meanings is the faithful will be saved by God, notwithstanding all the action of the villain, of the wicked ones. I quote from Philo Vitamosis, for the burning bramble was the symbol of those who suffered wrong, as the flaming fire of those who did it. Yet that which burned was not burned up, and this was a sign that the sufferers would not be destroyed by their aggressors. We would find that the aggression was vain and profitless, while the victim of malice escaped unharmed. The angel was a symbol of God's providence, which all society brings relief of to the greatest dangers, exceeding every hope. This meaning is also in the Jewish antiquity of Josephus. No one can overcome the will of God, not even if he contrives countless devices for it. The popularity and above all the religious significance of this kind of tradition are also demonstrated by those passages in the Gospel of Luke and Matthew that use them to narrate the birth of Jesus, as already said by Raymond Brown in the birth of the Messiah in the Gospel of Matthew. The dream of Amram corresponds to the dream of Joseph in Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1, verse 20 and following. Here also the moral dilemma revolves around a pregnancy and a divorce, because Amram decided not to divorce from his wife, even if the son will be killed by the Pharaoh. This is the problem at the onset of the story. While the dream of Miriam, Maria, that is the only positive experience of revelation attributed to a woman in Second Temple Jewish literature, corresponds to the announcement to Mary by Gabriel in Luke 1, 27, 38. That we can read here, the Spirit of God came upon Maria one night, and she saw a dream, reported it to her parents in the morning, saying, I had a vision this night, and behold, the man was standing in a linen garment, and he said to me, go and say to your parents, behold, the child who will be born of you will be cast into the water, likewise through him water will be dried up. And I will work signs through him and save my people, and we will exercise leadership always. in eternum, because it's in eternal. This is also a theme of Jewish tradition. The leadership of Moses is eternal. According another recurring theme in the parabiblical and midrashic text, Moses is predestinated, is predicted by God himself. God thought of Moses and issued a decree about his life before the flood. The verse is Genesis 6, verse 3. My spirit shall not abide, this is a very discussed word, yadon, in man forever, because he is flesh, and these days shall be 120 here. In Bereshit Rabbah and Midrash from late antiquity, the world and the fullness thereof were created only for the sake of the Torah. God I can't find sorry. In the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, prophecy and predestination are strictly connected. After Amram has decided not to divorce her wife, God said, because Amram plain hath pleased me, and he has not put aside the covenant between me and his fathers, behold, now he will be born from him, will serve me forever. And I, God, will kindle on his behalf my lamp to reside in him, my light to reside in him, and I will show him my covenant that no one has seen. And I will kindle an eternal light for him, because I thought of him in the days of old, saying, my spirit will not be a mediator among men forever. This is another translation of Yadon, because he is flesh, and his days will be 120, the age of Moses when he died. In the ascension of Moses, there is an allusion to the same biblical verse, but here God, and in some Jewish more or less contemporary interpretation, God devised and invented Moses at creation, at the act of creation. Therefore, he has devised and invented me, who have been prepared from the beginning of the world to be the mediator, the arbiter of his covenant. This tradition finds correspondence in some Jewish midrashic material, for example, in Bereshit Rabbah. For the sake of Moses, God created the world, because it was the world when Moses has to be born. Also in the second day, of the creation, this is another interpretation. There's no it was good. It was the day of the division of the waters. Why the waters were not good? Because good was Moses. When the significant when there is a tradition according to which when God say that the light was good, he was thinking of Moses. Because when Moses was born, the mother saw that he was good. It had a good look. It was vital. It was a beautiful baby. Yes, 5 minutes. Philo also, from this concept is expressed in the Ascension of Moses. But also Philo thought that Moses was pre-existing. That is, that Moses was a pre-existing soul. Philo believed in the pre-existence of soul. It's quite clear, even if it doesn't speak about it very, very often because it's not an argument in the interpretation of the Bible. When God lent Moses to earthly things and permitted him to associate with them, he endowed him not at all with the ordinary virtue of a ruler or king. Rather, he appointed him to be God and decreed that the whole bodily realm and its leader, the mind, should be his subjects and slave. This pre-existing Moses is identified in the Samaritan tradition with the light created in the first day. As I tried to say, also in the Jewish Midrash is present this concept. The Rabbi says, this is the Talmud, the Babli, the treatise Sotah, at the time when Moses was born, the entire house was filled with life, as is written here, and when she saw him that he was a goodly child, Tov, and is written there, and God saw the light, then it was good. Genesis 1:4. Well, we can now return to the face of Moses in the Cappella Palatina. What we read in the Bible in Deuteronomy 35, Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye had not dimmed, nor had he lost his natural freshness. So he wasn't old at all in this interpretation. But Rashi de Troyes, in the famous interpreter of the Torah that lived between the 10 and the 11th and 12th century CE, interpreted this way: freshness means moisture. Even after his death, decomposition did not take over his body, nor did the appearance of his face change. This is an interpretation that he took from a more ancient witness, that is the Sifrei Devarim, a midrash from the 2nd, 3rd century CE. He is 80 when he saw the burning bush, and is 120 when he died. So why he has this appearance? In my opinion, is because it's this concept of a man who is not corrupted. It's not the imaging of the terrestrial. This is not an imaging of the earthly Moses. This is an imaging of the heavenly, of a kind of heavenly Moses. Why? Because because we are talking about the burning bramble. Why the burning bramble? Why it's the burning bramble? It's a prophecy of Christ. It has to be a prophecy of Christ. The most diffused interpretation, the most common interpretation by the Father, there are many interpretations, but the most important is the burning bush was, the voice in the burning bush was the Logos, that is, a pre-existent Christ before he was born. But this is not a prophecy proper. This is an observation. No, I saw the scroll say, I saw the fire that is not consumed, that something eternal. If we say that the burning bush, there's another interpretation, is Jesus that died but did not experiment decay because he's resurrected by God. If we talk about Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, second chapter, 24 to 27, now God has resurrected him, freeing him from the pain of death. For David says about him, for you will not abandon my life to the Sheol, nor allow your Holy One to suffer corruption. So in this hypothesis of mine, I'm sorry for the Moses is a prophet not only with the verse of the scripture, but also with his character, his persona, and the way he is represented in the Cappella Palatina as an ageless and incorruptible entity, and probably also pre-existing. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. I did really like this paper. Of course, I have questions, but before we have, I give the floor to the people, to the public, and also we have to remind to check that if there is anyone that asking for questions from Zoom. The floor is yours. Tobias?
Thank you very much for this paper. And maybe my question is not just a question to you, but also an invitation to all the people here who are not text people. Like me, and we are text scholars, and you developed ideas about how motives develop and so on. But the question is, what is the idea of relation between text, or this kind of text which are developing, and image? How does the image relate to the writings you have here?
In general,
yeah,
you say.
And this is not just for you alone, but I would like to have this as a kind of a background question, and I think we should have even more dimensions also, like what Jens said, history of the time and so on. Please go.
Sorry, perhaps I can just add a little remark. At the beginning, you showed this image where Moses is depicted as a prophet. So and that is quite usual in Christian tradition, but also in, as you have shown, also with these Jewish texts. So that Moses is a
it's called a prophet.
Of course. And so my question would be. Could you say a little bit more about his relationship to other prophets in the Palatine chapel? So what is the idea of relating these Old Testament stories to the New Testament? Because there, in the nave there are scenes from the Old Testament and also from the New Testament. And I think they are related in a particular way. So is it usual, as it is in many other churches, that the prophets are prophets for Jesus? Or is there something special about
Well, I can remember of the Codex Purpureus, for example. There is an image of scrolls with prophecy of the life of Jesus by Old Testament character, for example. Well, I'm not a historian of art, but generally speaking, all the cycles of representation, if I understand your answer properly, are there are the typos and the antitupos. So
of course, that is very usual in many churches. And perhaps to this quotation, do you think that it comes from a written source, or is it just?
I don't know. I'll try to find out, because I try to find, for example, if it's a quotation. But I studied the quotation of Clement of Alexandria, but it's Proverbs. It's not. It's a textual. It's kind of textual history kind of study. I can't find. I can't nowadays. I can't find a source, a written source. It's a kind of paraphrases, maybe. I don't know.
I think in these mosaics, the artists do not rely exactly on written sources. I think sometimes they just use a version that they know perhaps from memory.
But it's quite a peculiarity of this quotation. It is the better Greek than the Septuagint. So maybe it's a written. I think it's somehow it's a written source, because the bathos is feminine. That is the classical form. While in the Septuagint, in the Philo, is masculine. And also catephlageto. It's a better translation of the Hebrew than katekaieto, because it's more destroyed than birthed up. So cateflegato somehow. So I think, but I didn't check it. Maybe it's a kind of text of the Septuagint, of a rework at the Septuagint, with the better Greek, with the better Greek. Yeah.
Antonino?
Grazie. I'll do it in English or Italian? No, I mean, it could be useful maybe to look to liturgical texts, for example.
Yeah.
I don't remember now because I've like in the past months I've checked these unpublished sources which could be interesting. The Typicon of the Mount Sinai monastery, where there's the liturgy of Saint Moses. Yeah, but my question is on another side because I'm very interested.
I'm interested in this kind of test.
No, I mean we can. I can give you the details of the source because it's digitalized.
Yeah,
it's just a 13th century manuscript.
All right.
No, the other point is this perennial youthfulness of Moses in the iconography. I don't know anything about it, I must confess, but I'm very interested in the fact that, for example, in the Near East, the iconography from Dura Europos to Sinai shows Moses with curly hairs and bearded, with the beard. Instead, we have this young man here, like almost adolescent, but with long hair. In contemporary icons from Sinai, the haircut is short. So this is very peculiar, and I'm very interested. I really don't know how to solve it, but it's...
Me neither.
I'm also like a very contemporary haircut.
Yeah, of course.
Aspetta un attimo. Can you wait
for the microphone?
Sorry, yes, excuse me. In your opinion, there was an intentional purpose, or it's absolutely non-intentional in the will of the artist?
No, I think it's intentional. It must be intentional because it's too strange. He's so young. In the scene of the metamorphosis of the transfiguration, he is dead and resurrected, is dead and transformed. For example, Philo said at the end of his life, he was transformed in nous, in pure nous. It was an endiad. It was no more a diadis, but was monadic, because like Adam, it was a perfect union of body and soul, and it was transformed. Maybe also that is transformed in the logos, but not all the scholars agree on this idea. It's very cryptic. When sometimes Philo, when speaks of Moses, it's slightly cryptic, as to say, well, I say this thing, but well, we will talk of it later, no? And here he must have 120 years. And he's young, it's exceedingly young.
Vittorio?
If I may, just two consideration. The first linked to the previous quotation that we found.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but maybe this kind of adjusted also from a rhetorical point of view statement can be derived also from homiletical texts.
Yeah, also.
Because often it's so that in homilies there is, so to say, a better version or a retelling of the scriptures in this sense, and I think it could be fit. And secondarily, I was thinking about this idea of a pre-existent Moses, since so there is maybe, I don't know if you can agree on this, if there is a possible link with the later developed theories, especially in Kabbalistic circles, about the pre-existence of the Torah.
Yeah,
because of course there is an identification between the prophet and the scripture.
I didn't say it, but naturally there is connection, because in many of the the text that speaks about Moses, Moses is for the Torah. When Ezekiel, this tragediographer, said that a mysterious man gave to Moses a throne, a scepter, and a crown, he is not Moses as a man, but is Moses as the incarnation of the Torah. And in Philo also, Moses embodied the order of creation. So is the Torah. It is a model, as the Torah is the model of the object, of the earthly objects. He saw the model, but it became also the model of the creation. So this is clear. Also in the turning of the era, is already a clear concept. And then in the Jewish tradition, in Genesis Rabbah, in Genesis Rabbah, this is very clear already that Moses is the Torah somehow. Thank you to you.
Yes, thank you. I could just add a small point to what you said, Vittorio. I was working with some manuscripts from the 13th century that were translated from Latin to Greek or Greek to Latin, and there you could find this always. So there is no standard version of any biblical text. There is no Septuaginta text. So they would either correct the version or they would focus on what they found translated. So if this is not a worse version, so it's not the thing to say, well, they have to correct it, but they would take it from another translator. So I find it rather often in written sources, in manuscripts. This is the first time I was pointed to an inscription or to mosaics in the Cappella Palatina, so I found it very interesting. This is just a comment to
Thank you.
Jens?
Just a short last remark. It's interesting that it is this quotation, because this quotation does not refer to the Torah or to Moses and the Torah, but to the appearance of God to Moses in the burning bush.
Yeah.
And when Moses is a prophet for Jesus Christ, so he indirectly is a witness for the divinity of Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
And that is interesting that it is exactly this quotation from that Exodus story where God appears to Moses, and now Moses becomes a witness for Jesus.
Yeah. Also in the Transfiguration is a witness of the divinity of.
Okay. Again, I mean, you were stressing this relationship with this figure of Moses and Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay. But there are two elements that made me think to also a completely different thing, but to Ezra, as you know, I like a lot. And so about Ezra, so about this fact that the composition didn't take Moses here, so that, but Ezra is in the apocryphal writings attributed to Ezra, Ezra is also the prophet who doesn't want to die.
As Moses, exactly like Moses.
Also,
yeah.
This is a link, and more than this, you were talking about the figure of a scribe or magician as the figure who can receive a prophecy.
Yeah.
So also this makes me think about the transformation of Ezra from scribe to prophet in the apocryphal literature.
Yeah.
So this could be another link to Moses, and I don't know if it is a link to this representation, but I mean, when you're talking about cluster of traditions, and it is, I think that Ezra tradition is part of this cluster.
Yeah. Also.
Just right Tobias. In other words, it's very present in many cities.
Yes.
Maybe it's associated in this case to the monarchy.
Also, Also, this is another part of the important, the very important part of the cluster of tradition about Moses. I think that in the more ancient part of the story of this tradition.
Yes, one more question. Then.
One more question. The important thing, the fact that he was attributed this kind of story of birth, it's because they had to say that Moses was a substitute. Moses and the Torah, that is Moses, is a substitute of the institution of monarchy as intermediary between the God and man. This is very clear, even from the first, for example, his story as an adult is very similar to the story of Jeroboam, the first king of Israel, because he's a rebeller against a king that imposes forced labor. Also, it's very. This is another argument,
Okay,
but.
Yes, thank you. Very short question. I mean, it's very interesting. Especially, was interesting for me to see also that Moses is close to Solomon, which is another figure linked with the idea of the dynastic line of Jesus.
Yeah.
So there is this line of interpretation by Herbert Kessler saying that, in fact, in the mosaics we can find also crypto messages.
Yeah.
Toward the Jewish people in order to emphasize the New Testament.
Yeah, the continuity between Old and the New Testament. Yeah.
Do you think it could be applied?
Absolutely.
Also
Absolutely.
Case?
And moreover, the prophecy that is in his hand, Solomon, it's a prophecy of the death of Jesus. That is a theme. There's no representation of the passion of Jesus in the Cappella Palatina, but here there's an allusion to the death to the death of Jesus. So I think that it's probable that this prophecy is a prophecy of resurrection, and is next to the prophecy of the death of Jesus.
Okay, thank you very much. And
thank you. Thank you for listening. This is my thank you, and this is my address also for.
Okay, Enrico Norelli.
Okay. Grazie.
Sì, grazie, mi occorrerà un po' d'acqua.
Okay, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Enrico Norelli, who was my director of my second PhD thesis in Geneva, and so it's he from, of course, University of Geneva, where he has been teaching for more than 30 years, and so now it's really nice to listen to you in this context. Thank you, Enrico.
So thank you, Emanuela. I'm very happy to be here and to have been invited for this meeting, and so thank you very much for being here. As you have seen in the program, I have changed the title of my. When I proposed the title for my.
Dobbiamo averlo più vicino.
Is it?
Se possibile.
So, can you hear now? Okay, thank you. When I proposed the title for my presentation, my intention was to compare 3 episodes from the life of Jesus, namely the Nativity, the flight into Egypt, and the baptism in the Jordan, with some ancient Christian narratives of these events. However, the first theme I addressed, the appearance of the star to the Magi, took up so much space in my presentation that I decided to dedicate the entire oral presentation I am about to deliver to it. And thank you for your understanding. In this oral presentation, I will omit any detailed discussion of the context in which the cycle of nativity scenes is located. I will only recall that it is situated on the corner wall of the south transept. I will focus only on a part of the scene depicted on the south wall. Let us first observe that on the wall dedicated to the Nativity of Jesus, the Magi appear twice. First, at the top left, when they see the star. Second, in the central horizontal band, when they offer their gifts to the child. The only other figure who appears twice on this wall is Jesus. What is striking is both the importance given to the episode of the star's appearance, enough to dedicate a specific area to it, effectively doubling the depiction of the Magi in the composition, and the considerable size of this first scene, which occupies, counting the angels as well, about a quarter of the wall, and is more visually prominent than the offering of gifts. Moreover, while the offering of gifts corresponds to the second part of the Magi narrative in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, the first moment of the Magi's story in the chapel does not correspond to the first part of Matthew's account, namely their arrival in Jerusalem and the encounter with Herod, an episode which is absent, simply absent from the chapel's mosaic, where Jerusalem does not appear at all. The ride of the Magi depicted here seems to have nothing to do with their arrival in Jerusalem, and is instead closely connected to the Magi's relationship to the star, with the star, clearly at a time preceding their adoration of the child. I would like to propose, if only as a hypothesis, a possible connection with the legend of the Magi as it appears in other narratives. Let us briefly observe the scene. The Magi are three, and they are kings, as shown by their crowns, identical in form but different in color. They are all of white race, but of different ages, decreasing from right to left. These three ages, white bird, dark bird, and no bird, already appear in the mosaic at Sant'Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, dating to the 6th century. They ride three horses of different colors, galloping across a mountain, in a mountainous region. Behind them, two mountain ranges are visible, and between them and the viewer of the mosaic rises the cave, which, relative to them, functions as a third mountain range. To the right of the cave, another line of mountains appears, lower and more uniform, sloping down toward the right-hand wall. These mountains also serve to organize the scenes on the entire wall, separating different planes and thus creating an impression of depth, the closest plane to us being the scene of the child's bath. Returning to the Magi on horseback, it seems clear to me that the curves indeed represent mountains. Their horses are clearly ascending a slope. Two of them point to the star with their arms, while the oldest, in the foremost position, gazes toward the star, shielding his eyes with his hand, which suggests a particular brilliance of the star. The mountains, thus, do not merely serve a compositional function, but are also real mountains, one of which the three Magi are ascending, accompanying their movement toward the star. But we may ask whether the setting of the Magi's journey in a mountainous region depends only on the general idea that in their long journey from the east they must cross mountains, or whether it might find some support in elements attested in written texts. Well, I omit something, and they have also a slide concerning this was matter two with the two moments, the scene in Jerusalem and the scene in Bethlehem, but here the things appear different from that. They had also a very ancient, in fact, image of the baby Jesus bath, which becomes a very frequent, in fact, representation in paintings or mosaics or so about the birth of Jesus. This is one of the most ancient I know. It is the Abbey of Nonantola in the province of Modena in Italy, created by Viligelmo, and this workshop around 1117, with the inscription Christos Lavatur under. But if the scene at the top represented the Magi, in fact, we must ask why the artist chose to give so much prominence to this scene, doubling the representation of the Magi. Certainly, it highlights the star's function as the Magi's guide, but this would have been sufficiently conveyed by the strong emphasis on the star and the ray of light it casts upon the newborn in the gift-offering scene. Based on the observations I have sketched, it seems preferable to recall that mountains play a significant role in an entire narrative tradition surrounding the Magi's story. We begin with the Cave of Treasures, preserved for us in two Syriac recensions and in one Arabic recension. whose oldest form may date back to the 3rd century, according to its editor. It is a narrative of universal history beginning from creation with a particular focus on the genealogical line of Christ and his mother Mary. According to this work, the giant Nimrod, named, as you know, in the list of nations in Genesis 10, 8-10, and in 1 Chronicles 1:10, as the son of Cush and grandson of Ham, as well as the first mighty one on earth, was said to be the first king of Babylon, and was taught by a 4th son of Noah, whose name was Jonathan. He was taught the wisdom and the books of Revelation, names astrology, which the Persians called Revelation and the Romans astronomy, while the Magi or magicians possessed astrology. This is a way of tracing back the origins of knowledge preserved among the Gentiles to the biblical lineage, which enabled them to discover the Savior through the Magi. Indeed, as the work narrates, shortly before the birth of Christ, a star appeared to the Magi in the firmament of heaven, more marvelous in appearance than all the other stars. In it there was a maiden holding a child, and a crown was placed on her head. The kings, the Magi, the Persians, the Chaldeans, and the wise, seized by astonishment and fear, said to themselves that it might be a king who had decided to descend from heaven to wage war against Nimrod. The Chaldeans and Magi hurried to consult their books of wisdom, and thereby the glorious word guided them to the truth. Here comes the quotation you have on the slide here and also on your handout on page 2. Thus the Magi, when they read Nimrod's revelation, found that a king was born in Judea, and the whole unfolding of the economy of the Messiah was revealed to them. Immediately following the genealogy they had received from their fathers, the tradition, they departed, left to the east, and ascended the mountains of Nod, those situated beyond the northern borders. There they took gold, myrrh, and incense. Understand this, my brother Mosiah, says the author of the text. They knew the entire mystery of the economy of our Savior from those gifts they carried: gold for the king, myrrh for suffering, and incense for the priest. These things showed that he would be king, healer, and priest, end of quote. But how could they know this mystery? The reader of the Cave of Treasures, having reached this point, already knows that this gold, incense, and myrrh have a long history. In fact, in chapter 5 of this work, when expelling Adam from paradise, God comforts him by announcing the future redemption wrought by his Son, who will descend and dwell in a virgin, and also commands him that after his death, he commands Adam, his body be embalmed with myrrh, incense, and storax, and placed in the Cave of Treasures, from which it will later be transferred to the center of the earth. Here, the trade of gold, incense, and myrrh has not yet appeared. What follows is the line that interests us. In the book of the Cave of Treasures, the entire history of humanity up to the flood unfolds around a mountain or a mountain complex, at whose summit lies the Garden of Eden, paradise. After sin and expulsion, Adam and Eve, driven by winds, descend the slopes of the mountain and find a cave in which they settle. Adam makes it the first place of worship outside paradise, taking gold, myrrh, and incense from the edges of paradise, as the text says, placing them in the cave, consecrating this cave as a house of prayer for himself and his children, and naming it the Cave of Treasures. Thereupon, Adam and Eve descend to the lower slopes, and there they unite, generating 2 pairs of twins, each time one male and one female, Cain and Levuza, and then Abel and Kelimta. Adam commands each male to marry the twin sister of the other, thus establishing the 2 fundamental moments of life outside paradise: worship and procreation, located on 2 levels of the mountain, progressively lower. There is the paradise, then the cave, which is a place of cult, in fact, of worship, and then the place of their dwelling, in fact, everyday life, in fact, which is a bit lower on the slope of the mountain. The first is to precede the second. Hence, Adam orders Cain and Abel to ascend to the cave of treasures and sacrifice to God there before descending to their dwelling to unite with their respective spouses. Cain, however, wished to marry Leuda, his own sister, twin sister, transgressing the prohibition on marrying one's own twin sister. And it was this that allowed Satan to enter him and cause the killing of Abel. One had to explain why God did not accept the sacrifice of Cain. So Cain was already sinner, in fact, in this respect, against the will of his father. So this increased Cain's jealousy, the fact that God rejected Cain's sacrifice, and led him to kill his brother as they descend toward the valley to return to their homes. In Cain, the harmony between worship given to God and the fundamental norms of social life is thus broken. The fracture is symbolized by Abel's murder occurring as they descend from the cave of treasures to human dwellings. Between two, Cain kills Abel, in fact. It's under the place of worship when they are returning to their everyday life, so to say. The fracture is symbolized by Abel's murder, occurring, in fact, after Adam's death. His third son, Seth, as commanded by Adam in obedience to God, restructures the world's levels. He, Seth, ascends to the cave of treasures to bury his father's body. Then Seth brings his own children and their families to the glorious mountain where Adam is buried, while Cain and his descendants remain below in the valley where he killed Abel. Seth's people, characterized by purity and holiness, are called sons of God. And they are what the scriptures referred to in Genesis 6:1 and following as sons of God. The sons of God who later united themselves with the daughters of men, in fact. And this avoids attributing the sin with the daughters of men to angels. The story is later narrated in Cave of Treasures. This placement of Seth's descendants is key to understanding the vertical spatial paradigm of the Cave of Treasures. The place where Seth establishes his surroundings of paradise lay 30 palms below paradise, says the text, and required no agricultural work, for, so says the text, they were nourished by every desirable fruit and enjoyed the fragrance and sweet aroma emanating from paradise. This is indeed inspired by Genesis 3:24, and its Septuagint rendering, he placed him to dwell opposite the paradise of pleasure, and interpreted within ancient exegetical traditions, such as a phrase by Irenaeus in his demonstration of apostolic preaching, chapter 16, which phrases it that they dwelled around paradise, or also, well, as some translators give, on the way leading to paradise. This must be a very ancient tradition because it appears in the Cave of Treasures and in other Christian texts in the time following. Thus, the biblical narrative up to the flood is reinterpreted this way. Seth's descendants, as sons of God, live almost 2 millennia near paradise and bury Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Lamech, Methuselah, and Lamech, father of Noah, in the Cave of Treasures, located between paradise and their dwelling. But despite each generation's oath never to descend to Cain's offspring, they eventually violate it by descending, uniting with Cain's daughters, and producing giants. At Lamech's death, only Noah, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives remain above with him. On the point of death, Lamech gives Noah instructions for the ark. After Lamech's death and burial in the Cave of Treasures, Noah is to descend the mountain with his family, bringing only Adam's body and the 3 gifts, gold, myrrh, and incense. He is to place Adam's body at the center of the ark and the 3 gifts above it, above the body of Adam, distributing males and females on the eastern and western sides of that body, preserving separation in every respect. The ark thus becomes, during the flood, both microcosm and sanctuary. The removal of Adam's body and the gifts from the Cave of Treasures and their transfer to the ark, as well to the final farewell to paradise, the holy mountain, the cave, and the bodies it held, occurs in chapter 17 at the beginning of the 3rd millennium of the story of humanity. Here, however, only myrrh and incense are mentioned. Once Noah and his companions exit the ark, they build a village and till the land. From this moment, humanity's fall reaches its low point, and the symbolic space of human history becomes horizontal rather than vertical. Of course, mountain persists, but this is not humanity lives in the plain, in fact. However, Adam's body remains in the ark. Only when Noah is dying does he secretly instruct his firstborn Shem, under angelic guidance, to remove it and bury it in the center of the earth, the spot where at creation the earth had converged through divine force from the 4 points of the compass. In the same spot, the redemption of Adam and all his son will occur through the crucifixion of Christ, as explained in detail in chapter 49. It was also there that Isaac's sacrifice, the Akedah, took place, a foreshadowing of Christ's salvific death. Humanity's new beginning after the flood thus involves a new spatial center marked by Adam's presence, but not below, not above, namely the center of the earth, destined from creation to become the axis of salvation history, passing through Abraham's promise, the Akedah, and Christ's crucifixion. Here, however, a problem arises as Adam's body is transferred from the ark to the center of the earth. There is no mention of the 3 or 2 gifts that had accompanied him, and they are never mentioned again, gold, incense, and myrrh. If one were to assume that they were buried with Adam at the center of the earth, they would remain inaccessible at least until the crucifixion, since the text says that the door to this place remains sealed until Jesus' blood flows from the cross into Adam's skull. Yet, if gold, incense, and myrrh were removed from the Cave of Treasures, as Lamech instructed Noah, how could the Magi later fetch them from the mountains of Nod in chapter 45 of the text? Well, this would be a bit long to explain, but let's say that there is a relationship between the text of Cave of Treasures and another document known as the Testament of Adam, used in numerous ancient writings, but which has come to us in independent form only in Syriac and Arabic. For our present purposes, it suffices to refer to the study by Stephen Edward Robinson, together with the edition and translation of the Syriac text, from which I quote. Yes, you have it here. Of the 3 sections composing the transmitted form, which is not very long, the second, commonly designated as the prophecy, is the actual discourse of Adam to his son Seth, containing a brief narrative of the future redemption wrought by the Son of God following Adam's sin, which was revealed to him by the Son himself in paradise immediately after Adam had eaten the forbidden fruit and just before his expulsion. Seth recounts the death of his father and his burial at the east of paradise, opposite to the city which was built on the earth, which was named the city of Enoch. neither displacement of the body nor the details of the funeral correspond to those in the caves of treasures, but what follows is of interest to us. You have this here. And I sealed this testament of Adam, and I set the son of our father Adam, who came from God, placed it in the cave of treasures with the offerings which our father Adam had taken out of the paradise of God. These are gold and myrrh and frankincense. And behold, the Magi are coming, the sons of kings, and they will take up these offerings and will bring them to Bethlehem of Judea. Thus, it is clear that in this tradition, the testament remains in the cave of treasures along with the gifts until the coming of the Magi, while Adam's body is buried elsewhere. So another form of the legend, in fact, it is the testament of Adam remains in the cave, but Nimrod received through the son of Noah the hidden revelation, in fact, which told that, which was written in books which was written in books of the Persians, in fact, and so that the Magi did not know directly the Testament of Adam, but they knew the books in which Nimrod had written that a star would appear and that this star would mean the birth of a king of the world, in fact. The problem was, of course, how the Magi could know that a new king, in fact, had been born in the West for them. When they come to Herod, they say that, but how did they know through the star this? And so there is only a hidden wisdom, a wisdom's tradition that was kept by the Magi on the mountain of the Cave of Treasures, and in other texts it would belong to. This is another form, the synthesis that we have in the Cave of Treasures Oriental Recension. Okay. Sorry, no, I am going in the worst. The Opus Imperfectum in Matteum, this may be interesting because it is a text in Latin that could be available to people who made mosaics. We do not know, I don't know any witness that says that, but it was a text that circulated in the West at the time. So it was, this is text from the 5th century. In fact, this is a series of homilies that recast a commentary, partial commentary to the Gospel of Matthew, in fact, and it has been transmitted to us in Latin. And there is this text, you see, this form of a legend. It would be long, but this is this form of legend. The Magi knew the mountain of victories, and the mountain of victories was the mountain in which was the cave of the treasures, so that each year they went on these mountains and they scrutined the heaven in order to sky, in fact, in order to see whether the star had appeared or not. And at a given moment, the star had appeared. The star appeared, and so they knew that they had to go into the cave and take the three gifts, in fact, gold, incense, and myrrh, and leave to the west in order to bring them as to the king that had been born. There are also other forms of but I cannot read them because we had no time enough. So this will go in the written text that you will find in the Acts. There is a long form of this legend that has come to us in a Syriac text, which is called the Chronicle of Tsuknin. There is only just one manuscript, and an American an American professor whose name is Brent Landau has begun to study this. He's preparing a new edition of this text. In this chronicle was inserted the history of the Magi, where the Magi recounted, they told themselves the story, the apparition of the star, and this is a very, very long and lengthy text, in fact, in which they recount their travel to the west, and they come back, and so on and so on. Probably this chronicle used an existing text that was this revelation of the Magi. Now I'm going to I have 5 minutes. Okay, you're writing, so I go to the conclusion. We have established how in different developments of the legends about the Magi, mountains play an important role. In the Cave of Treasures, the Syriac recension, immediately after the star's appearance, the Magi, who according to this work live in Persia, consulted the books containing the wisdom revealed to Nimrod and learned that a king had been born in Judah. And then they went down and left the east, says the text. They climbed the mountains of Nod, located above the northern borders, and from there they took gold, myrrh, and frankincense. As we have seen, this is a fundamental stage in the story of the Magi, which connects it, the story of the Magi, with the entire previous sacred history to which the Cave of Treasures belongs. In fact, it goes back to Adam. In the Cave of Treasures, Nod, and more precisely the forest of Nod, is not only the place where Cain is exiled, based on Genesis 4:15, it is also the forest where Lamech kills Cain, and above all, it is the place where Nimrod goes to visit Jonathan, son of Noah, who teaches him the wisdom transmitted by Noah, the same wisdom that will allow the Magi to understand the meaning of the star and to ascend the mountains of Nod to take the three gifts whose Christological significance is essential in his work. If we move to the version attested by the Chronicle of Zuknin and by the Opus Imperfectum, we find that the book of books of Seth were transmitted through his descendants until the time of Noah, saved in the ark, and then handed down through the generations after the flood to the predecessors of the Magi themselves. It is these predecessors who placed them on the mountain of triumphs or of victories, east of Shir, says the text, our land, in a cave, the cave of treasures of the mysteries of silent life. When the star appears, the Magi must go and take them, ascending the mountain, and bring them with gifts wherever the light of the star leads them. We have seen the importance of the Mountain of Victories as the place of liturgies that mark the waiting for the king promised by the revelations and so on. Now, of course, in the mosaic, I went back to the mosaic of the Palatin Chapel, we do not find most of the traits mentioned in these accounts, traits which also change from one version of the same text to another. However, if we return to our mosaic, it is legitimate to hypothesize that the traditions represented by the texts we have reviewed may have influenced its composition. I do not say that the authors of the mosaics had read this text. The text, the Opus Imperfectum might have been available to them, but the Syriac text, I'm not sure, in fact, about the legend circulated. They help us, these texts, understand the importance given to a moment preceding the actual adoration of the child and the delivery of gifts by the Magi. The moment of the star's appearance to the Magi, which in the canonical text of Matthew is not even narrated in the main text, but only mentioned by the Magi in their request for directions to the place where the newborn king was. In the image, the scene occupies a proportionally large space, greater than that of the gift-giving, and its position indicates its anteriority. The star appears to the Magi as they ascend on horseback a mountain. The first one, shielding his eyes with his hand, alludes to the extraordinary brightness of the star, a trait that accompanies almost all mentions of it in the texts except in Mitium, and is strongly emphasized in those texts we examined. The other two seem to be in dialogue with each other, the other two magi seems to be in dialogue with each other about the star, perhaps questioning or greeting it after a long wait. The praying angels are not prominent in the texts we examined, but in the Chronicle of Zuknin, the Magi see, I quote, that heaven had been opened like a great gate, and men of glory carrying the star of light upon their hands. And they descended and stood upon the pillar of lights. End of the quote. This is not the attitude nor the function of the three angels in the mosaic, but here, as in the text, they express that the star is part of the divine plan that is unfolding. The three angels seem to correspond in some way to the magi. There are three, each is above one of the magi, and the orientation of their faces is the same as that of their respective magi. The star in the mosaic contains no image, as in the text there was the image of also a young virgin with child, in fact, but it comes immediately from God, as shown by its position within concentric semicircles, and the ray issuing from it enters the cave and ends in the child held by the Virgin. This cannot help but remind us of the bright column of light surmounted by the star in the Chronicle of Zuknin. Also in the mosaic, it penetrates the dark cave and somehow generates the child, or at least bathes him in its brilliance. I am not claiming that whoever made the mosaic had read the text we have examined, or that they had iconographic manuals that used those texts, but it seems more than legitimate to draw attention to the possible, in my view quite probable, influence of the traditions that have come down to us in the writing we considered. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Enrico, for this challenging paper, and I open the floor to the public here and to the people following via Zoom. Tobias, and then Jens.
Thank you very much for this wonderful paper. A little remark and then a question which is maybe not just addressed to you. The remark, I think that there are options that at least the opus imperfectum is read until the minimum the 13th century. I was collecting evidence beside what Brent Landau is doing, and I come until 1280, mainly in the Flemish world, not in this part of the world. So I think there is a chance. And the question now is, so in how far would you interpret this image here, first and foremost as a biblical image, or integrating apocryphal traditions?
Which image, excuse me, which image?
Yeah, the overall image, so the overall image which you showed.
The overall image, yes.
The overall image,
Yeah, you can put it
but,
back.
Let's put again.
But they do that now.
Which one?
Yeah, this one, yeah. So this composition, in how far would you interpret it more or less as something which has to be there in such a context, as a mixture of biblical and apocryphal traditions, or is it also something which, let's say, gives a kind of a statement about being royal in such context, so that the kings are coming twice and so on. So and maybe there is also a chance that we come a bit in a dialogue with the art historians who could say, okay, is there more at stake, or is it just something? So 2 questions in one.
Two questions in one.
Maybe we can collect the two
yes,
and
yes.
then we can answer.
Perhaps I can relate my question to that. I think that mosaic is quite interesting because it integrates many features that are typical for depicting the birth story. So you have not a stable, what is quite interesting, but the cave. So that is mentioned from the 2nd century onwards in several texts, and you have that also in many paintings. You have the cave without the stable, so you have only the manger, but the manger is in a cave, not in a stable. What is interesting here is that you have the magi twice, or the kings twice. You have them on the left-hand side coming, and then on the right-hand side presenting their gifts to Jesus. And below, and I have to say that because I have written an article about that. Below you have the midwives. So that is also very interesting. They have disappeared from the, I think, 16th century onwards. They have disappeared because they don't have a biblical basis. But of course, ox and donkey don't
midwife,
have.
You say, is the disappeared.
Yeah, the midwives.
Right.
And you have them here, and you have them. There are many examples for midwives as a very typical feature of the birth of Jesus, and you have all of these characteristics here. And just a last remark, Mary is very prominent here. So you have a very big in the center, and I would interpret that also as a mosaic that gives very much prominence to Mary. So that is, I think, also peculiar for that mosaic in comparison to other pictures.
Okay,
thank you.
Reply,
okay, yes. Of course, what I found interesting in this mosaic was the fact that we have a first stage, a first scene with Magi, which is prior to the adoration of the baby Christ, and it's different from what we have in most iconographic images and in texts, where you have Herod, Mages with Herod, and then Mages with the child, in fact. But here you don't have at all Magi with Herod. You have a scene that apparently is prior to any other scene in this complex, on this wall, and where the Magi see the star while they are ascending a mountain, in fact. Of course, you don't have the Cave of Treasures here. I referred to the Cave of Treasures and other texts because they are texts that give a great prominence to mountains, in fact, to this mountain. In the Cave of Treasures, what is interesting is that the whole history of the world, from the expulsion from paradise until the flood anyway, is a descent, is structured as a descent from the top of the mountain to the plain. This is a rereading of the history of humanity, and of course, this is not a mise en scène of these texts. This is clear, but I find that giving prominence to a first and chronologically prior, in fact, image of the moment of the Mages on a mountain, when they see the star, when they speak to each other of the star, the second and the third are doing this. In fact, on the first is doing so because the star is too bright, in fact, so on. This corresponds to some elements of the history that we have in the text. Then the Chronic of Tsuknin, for instance, I said it is unbearably lengthy. In fact, it expands on every detail and so on. The Opus Imperfectum is clearly un riassunto, come si dice, a synthesis, a summary of the story and so on. But it could be available, the story of the mountain, as a first important moment of the story of redemption was important. Then, of course, the cave where Mary is not the same as the Cave of Treasures. This is very, very clear. In the Chronic of Tsuknin, there are two different scenes. There is a scene where the Magi in the cave of treasures have a first revelation of the coming of the child with a column of light that enters that cave. And then when they come to Bethlehem, in fact, they see directly the baby and the star with a new column of light. So it's clearly a doubling of the scene. All of this is not here, but what I wanted to show you was that I have been impressed by this form of the presentation of the Magi, which is not so frequent in my opinion. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, I do not think there are many images of the Magi seeing the star before before the evangelic story, in fact, on the mountain. And then, of course, here it is put together with the usual scenes of the. But there are things which are interesting. For instance, and then I stop. You see Joseph in this in the corner, which is sitting there, and he's looking there, and is absorbed. Come si dice assorto? Is sì, assorto. Yeah, thinking of it. And I knew, of course, this is a well-known theme in the iconograph tradition, because it means that Joseph has nothing to do with the birth of the child. He is aside. In this case, he turns his face, but in some other Giotto. Think of Giotto, for instance. He's looking something, or he's sleeping or so, and he's not sleeping. He's regarding, but it is he is aside, in fact, and the text says that the Magi tell that when they entered the cave, they saw Joseph absorbed it in a corner. In fact, I only knew otherwise. I only know this as an iconographic motive, but not as a literary motive. Okay. But here you find it. I have not yet made research in order to see in which other text we have this idea about Joseph. But it is not only an iconographic motive. It is also a literary motive in the Cave of Treasures. One who should be. So here there is a kind of osmosis, or what could I say, between text and images.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we have to go really quickly to the last paper. Thank you very much, Enrico. So we should have, you maybe can see Eric Nofke. Okay. In absentia, we have the name. Okay. Okay, it's a pleasure to introduce Eric Nofke, that we already had the pleasure to listen yesterday for the initial greetings, and so he's teaching New Testament at the Valdations Faculty of Theology, so the floor is yours, Eric.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, okay, hi everybody. Nice to see you online. Sorry, but I have my voice coming back. It's not easy to.
Maybe we can fix it.
I don't know.
Prova, Eric. Prova a parlare.
Now, oh, no, I still hear my voice, but okay, I just go on because the time is short. Now, if you look at the dome in the Palatin chapel, high you can see that there is an image of Christ at the center, surrounded by angels. Now, how do we get to this idea of Jesus being superior to the angels and being different from the angels. The letter to the Hebrews can help us to find a few glimpses, a few ideas about this this question, because right at the start of the letter, the author of the letter insists a lot on the fact that Jesus is superior to the angels. So why is that? Well, we shall see if the text gives us some ideas, comparing the text to the literature, to the Jewish literature of the time. Now, first thing, in the first verses of the letter, we receive a short summary, and quite interesting summary, of the letter's Christology. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, we read, "Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he created the worlds. He is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being, and he sustains all things by his powerful word. When he had made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high." Now, first of all, we have the designation of Jesus as the Son. And this puts, first of all, Jesus in a very special position at the right side of God. He's been, the text says, he's been established heir of everything. And this means that he shares the God's kingship over the world. Then it goes on saying that, okay, the Son has been appointed heir of everything. Why? First of all, because he continues the work of revelation. He continues the revelation that was started by the prophets. And he is the tool of communication between God and his people, our fathers and us. Second, the Son has made the universe. Okay, now these two things are the typical attributes of the logos in the Gospel of John. And this is not the first. This is only the first similarity we will see. So we have a Son. He has been appointed heir of everything. He has continued the work of revelation. Second, he has made the universe. Beside these two, to underline the specificity of the Son, he also said that he's the reflex of God, of God's glory. And again, since according to the Bible, human beings cannot see God directly, he again is a kind of mediator between God and his people, so that we can see God through the Son. And all this aims to one specific point. The main aim of the Son's work is the purification of sins. This is the central idea of the whole letter. And this idea, the fact that the idea of purification of sins is at the center of the work of the Son in the world, puts the letter to the Hebrews in a very specific Jewish tradition. I mean, the Enochic tradition, or if you prefer, the apocalyptic tradition. Because it's in this tradition, and not in the Old Testament, for instance, that you have the idea that the world has to be cleansed by its sin, that the world is being corrupted by an original sin. In the Enochic tradition, in the tradition that you find in the books of Enoch, the cause of this corruption are the watchers, the angels that were supposed to check that everything in the world goes in the right direction, but they fall in love with the human women, and they mixed heaven and earth with this sinful intercourse, and they in this way pollute the world and make evil working in the world. So there is an original pollution, an original corruption that has to be fixed. So this, since in the letter of to the Hebrews, the main issue of Jesus' work is, or mission if you prefer, is to fix the problem. This puts us in relation to this specific tradition. And this is the first point. Now, having set the stage in these first verses, the letter to the Hebrews says two more very important things about Jesus' work. First of all, that, okay, we know that Jesus is the Son, but now in our days, he says in chapter 2, verses 8 through 9, he says, now in these days we cannot see this scenery in front of us. This is something happening in the heavens. Now, what can we see? We can see the person of Jesus and what he has done. Jesus, who's been made a little, sorry, just go to the text. Chapter 2, verse 8, it says, we do see Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels. This is the reference to the incarnation of the Son of God. Now, after his death, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. So, to understand the Son, we have to go through the incarnated Son, through the person of Jesus, and in the letter he stressed very much the real fact of the incarnation, the real fact of Jesus' suffering. So this is something real that had to be done in order to cleanse the humankind or the world, because the whole world is polluted from sin. Now, this Jesus can accomplish his task of cleansing the world because at the same time he has been made priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So this is chapter 2, verses 14. Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same thing, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. For it is clear that he did not come to help angels, but the descendants of Abraham. Therefore, he had to become like his brothers and sisters in every respect, so that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people, because he himself was tested by what he suffered. He is able to help those who are being tested. And this is the one of the main points of the letter. Jesus and the Son has been appointed as a priest, as a high priest, so that he could do perform the sacrifice of atonement, and at the same time, incarnation was necessary so that he could offer himself as the sacrificial victim. So in Jesus, the whole meaning of the temple is incarnated in a perfect way. Why? Because the worldly temple, the temple in Jerusalem, has a very limited power, while Jesus refers to the heavenly temple, and in this way he can perform that sacrifice that fixes the original corruption of the um, angels, or according to the tradition we find in the Apostle Paul, the sin of Adam and Eve. The two traditions then go together. Now, what is very interesting, and so that we can start seeing at the problem, why the angels, why the comparison to the angels. How can Jesus be high priest if he is a descendant of Judah and not of Levi? Well, the reference point is Melchizedek. Now, it's very interesting because this Melchizedek that we find in the Old Testament only in Genesis and in Psalm 104 has quite interesting developments Middle Jewish literature, and in the mind of the Hebrews.
Sorry, Eric, we can't hear you anymore. Probably you.
Sorry, just
okay.
These things sometimes stops. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
I was saying that he makes reference, or he has probably in mind two texts, or the tradition behind two texts. 11Q Melchizedek from the Qumran text, where Melchizedek is represented as a last time, end times leader of the angels that will make vengeance over the sinners, and to Enoch, where Melchizedek was born in a very strange way, but the point is that he was born with the garments of the high priest on himself, and after a little while on earth he is sent, he goes into the heavens again, an angelic figure. Then so. And this is one first possible reason why, but we will talk about it at the end, why Hebrews feels that it has to be underlined that Jesus is above all the angels. So he's the new high priest, we were saying, and for this reason he's also the one who realizes the new pact that was promised through the prophet Jeremiah. Okay, now we will not talk about that, but so far we have a representation of the Christology of the letter that looks very much similar to the one we find in several other texts from the New Testament. For instance, Philippians 2, 5 through 11. You know, the Christological hymn, where we have the same description of Jesus' mission. Now, we have in the hymn, in the letter to the Philippians, we don't have a name given to this person. In the letter to the Hebrews is the Son. In the letter to the Philippians, Paul just says that Jesus Christ, but then this is the beginning of the hymn that he reports in the letter. He says, "Who was in the form of God and similar to God." So it doesn't specify the Son or whatever. It just refers to Jesus Christ without specifying a title, specific title or definition of Jesus before the incarnation. Then he humbles himself, he empties himself of all his divinity, let's say, and so much that he dies on the cross, and then he is, as the text says, hyperupsosen, glorified above every other being in the world, and proclaimed as Kyrios, as Lord, for the glory of God the Father. So this is the typical Christology we see in many different early Christian texts. Now, if this is true, at the same time, then we see that in order to express clearly his main theological issue, namely the cleansing from sin, he has referred to the, first of all, to the divinity in some way of Jesus, of the not Jesus, of the Son, and secondly to the figure of Melchizedek. So this, in some way, even more than in the text of Philippians, we are projected in the world of the representations of the heavenly court of God in Middle Jewish texts. And in this world of these apocalypses, we find the representation of God's court exactly, not exactly, but very similar to the courts of the emperors, of the big kings of the ancient times. I don't know, we don't have time to read some of these texts, but if you go to First Enoch, for instance, 14, so we are probably in the 3rd century before Christ, we have this grand representation of the heavenly court with the throne of God in the middle of everything, a little bit like we have Christ in the middle of the circle of the angels in the Palatin chapel. We have God in the middle of a court made of hundreds or thousands of angels. So we have this world, this heavenly realm full of this heavenly being. Most of them are good, do good things. Some of them do also terrible things, like the watchers in First Enoch. As I said, they were the cause of the corruption of the world. But this is a world full of these heavenly beings. Similar thing we find in the book of Daniel, where we have an important development, or yes, let's say it, development, because while in the more ancient texts that are part of First Enoch, we have only God in the middle of these thousands of angels. In the book of Daniel, chapter 7, we see a second figure being put strongly close to the figure of God. In chapter 7, we have in verse 9, we see that in this vision, all these beasts, terrible beasts that are doing lots of terrible things, at the moment of the judgment, we see a throne, two thrones that are put in the heavens. One is for this old person that is God, served by thousands of angels. But in verse 13 it says, I was looking, I was seeing in my night visions, and now coming from on the clouds of the sky, somebody similar to a son of man. And this person is, this heavenly being, is distinguished from the angels and is put close to the throne of the Lord of God. This image is developed in the first book of Enoch, in what is called, in the section that is called the book of the parables. And in the book of the parables, we have the image of the Son of Man, namely the one similar to a Son of Man becomes a title, some kind of messianic, you can say, but messianic title. And there is, in this kind of the book of parables in some ways is a midrash of the book of Daniel, or at least of the chapter 7 of the book of Daniel. In this midrash, we see that this the figure that we have, similar to a son of man, similar to a man that we have in the book of Daniel, becomes a very specific person with a very specific role. First of all, he's assimilated very much to God. He's very close to God. He gets much of God's power. He makes the judgment, while in Daniel it seems like that God is doing the judgment himself. He was appointed. His name was called before the creation. So there is a deepening of the figure of the Son of Man, and he becomes kind of a semi-god or a second god. I don't have time here to develop the issue, but there are several big scholars, very important scholars like Daniel Boyarin, Sigal, and others that have suggested the possibility that we have to consider kind of not a trinity but a binity, the idea that God has two faces in some way, so that these two figures are at the same time one only God. So it's a very interesting and intriguing suggestion. But the point is that this figure is not an angel, or is similar to an angel, but is something much more than an angel. One more thing in brackets. In these visions of the contained in the book of parables, the wisdom of God appears, and this is quite interesting because in the development of the Christology, Christian Christology, the characteristic of the wisdom of God will be attributed to Jesus. So this is maybe another possible hint that the first book of Enoch was very clear in the minds of the New Testament in the New Testament writers. So we have Daniel, we have first Enoch, we have those references to Melchizedek as an angelic figure in in 11q Melchizedek, and into Enoch. Now, to get to the conclusions, because I see that the time is running short, to get to the conclusions, I think that comparing or setting the letter to the Hebrews in this context, in the context of the Enochic literature and tradition and theological world, and those other theological words that connected to the tradition of Enoch, like Qumran and others, I think that we understand why the letter to the Hebrews starts with this long disquisition about the fact that Jesus is not, the Son is not an angel, and it is not to be confused with angels, because the whole first chapter develops, with lots of biblical references, develops this point. Well, because he wants to stress, first of all, that Jesus, I mean, the resurrected Jesus, proclaimed Son and everything, is what this tradition was identifying as the Son of Man, as a title. He wants to stress that the Son of Man is the Son of God and is strictly related to God. At the same time, you see, we have seen at the beginning that identifying Jesus as the Word of God puts later in very strong connection with the Logos theology of the Gospel of John. So some of these characteristics of the wisdom, of God's wisdom, are absorbed by the figure of the Son of God, Jesus the Christ, the Son of God. So he develops that in order to say that, okay, the Son is related to God and not to the angels, and the fact that he needs Melchizedek in order to support his thesis on the fact that Jesus is the high priest, forces in some way the letter to the Hebrew to say, okay, you have in mind that figure of Melchizedek. You think Melchizedek is closer to the angels. I said that Jesus is a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, but this doesn't make him an angel. This makes him the Son of God. So if you want to understand who Jesus was, the meaning of his mission, of what he did in his giving his life to death and so on, you have to understand that that person is related, strictly related to God and not to the angels. Also, for another reason, maybe, and this is just a suggestion, in First Enoch 69:11, the text says that men have been created to be like the angels. Okay, so the angels in this worldview are closer to the creation, closer to humans than to God. And in this picture, we have to read what the book of the letter to the Hebrews is saying. In this picture, you have to see Jesus, the Son of God, on the side of God and not on the side of creation. And in this way, we understand very well the picture, the mosaic we have in the dome of the Palatin chapel. I hope it was clear enough. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, I'm here. But now I cannot hear you.
Yeah, I know. Now you can hear me, I guess.
Yes.
And, okay, thank you for this trial to read this image through the Enochic tradition. This is really a good challenge again. So I give you the floor. So Caterina Moro and then Jens.
Just an observation on Jewish tradition. In Philo of Alexandria, in the Vita Moses, is told that Moses was appointed heir to God. When he made the plagues, it was because he has the control of the universe as heir of God, because he renounced to be king of Egypt to some extent. But it put this observation of in the story of Moses as heir and prince of Egypt, more or less. But this important thing that Moses, that is the Torah probably, is the heir of God.
Okay. Eric? Do you want to answer now?
You want to answer right away?
Okay, maybe a comment. Okay, Jens?
Thank you, Eric. Just a short remark on that mosaic, what you referred to at the beginning. We have a biblical quotation. I just looked it up again. We have a biblical quotation that is not from the New Testament, and that biblical quotation says, "Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool," says the Lord, the Pantocrator.
Yeah.
So, and that means that Jesus Christ is presented here as the Pantocrator, who is above all things. So that, and I'm not so sure whether that is really inspired by Hebrews. Usually the Pantocrator image of Christ that you have, of course, very often in the mosaic since the 5th century, is usually more inspired by the revelation of John. And for example, in Santa Pulenziana, the mosaic in Santa Pulenziana is a clear image, a clear presentation of the 12 thrones and the 12 gates of the heavenly Jerusalem that I mentioned in the revelation of John and so on. And that whole Pantocrator thing, that is of course very much in the background of that mosaic here. I think that would be important also to interpret that mosaic, so that image that you referred to at the beginning.
Do you have something to reply, Eric?
Oh yes, I fully agree. It was me that put Hebrew in the picture, but I thought it was more something less known. This text of Hebrews, so I thought it could be interesting to talk about it. Getting inspiration from the image of Jesus above the angels. So this I just took the inspiration from the picture, but I didn't want to explain the picture. I fully agree with you. That's a Pantocrator, and I agree with that. Yes, and Moses in Philo is quite interesting because we have this kind of how can I say, exaltation of Moses or apotheosis of Moses, if you want, in Philo, that recalls, and I think that, yes, several of the also other biblical, I say, I don't know if I can use this word apotheosis, but okay, ascensions to the heavens like Elijah or like Enoch himself, who was who had his apotheosis. And I think that in some way that idea of Moses could also be in the mind of the author of the Hebrews. And one of the reasons why he wanted to express that Jesus is not just a special man that was accepted into heaven like Enoch or like I don't know, like Moses in this case, but he was something totally different. The quality of the person is totally different from the quality of Moses or Elijah or Enoch and so on. So but it's quite interesting to see that there are lots of connections.
Great, thank you. And the last question for Vittorio, and then we will go for our lunch.
Thank you very much, Eric, for this interesting contribution. I liked it particularly because I'm biased, since the point is that, as you probably know, I'm working with the Epistula Apostolorum, and my thesis is basically that the Epistula Apostolorum has the same purpose to what you just explained about Hebrews, basically. And through a Johannine lens, there is then a total identification between the Son and the Father, so to say, in a perspective of reaffirming the superiority of the Son over the angels. And especially, so there is also a confession of faith in the Ethiopic version at the beginning, but so I had to think about this because probably the Epistula Apostolorum was correcting traditions like the Ascension of Isaiah and even something about the Greek Apocalypse of Peter, probably, or something like this. But at the end, so there is the final ascension of the Lord after the revelation given to the disciples, and there is a choir of the angels who sings, "Gather us, O priest." And so the title of priest, the priesthood of Christ, is always stressed as an important element and a future which can't be covered fully by angels. And I think probably there is a connection between Hebrews, or at least a reception of Hebrews, even if it's not openly quoted in the text. And so my question to you is, of course, if you have an opinion on this, where do you think the letter to the Hebrews was composed? So, or even if you can imagine a circulation, because what you are saying about this reflection about angels and the plurality, the internal plurality of God as one, was an issue in Second Temple Judaism. We know it also in Philo, the idea of that the Logos was also called Archangel, for example, and this is another quotation. And all these titles who can eventually be referred to the Logos in Christian context and John 9 context were also applied in Hebrew circles to the Torah, to Moses, and so on. I think play a role in shaping the Christian identity in the first 2 centuries of Christian era. So I think that the Epistula Apostolorum was written in Asia Minor. But do you think that there is some kind of connection, at least in terms of place of production?
Okay, good question. I don't know, frankly, where the letter was written, and I think that this is not very important, because I think that what is important is the strong connection with Alexandria, with Philo, with that world. Now, that could happen in Alexandria, but it could also happen in Jerusalem. Why not? I mean, there were lots of Hellenized, strongly Hellenized Jews in Jerusalem, or somewhere in a big city, in Antiochia, for instance. But I think that what is important is to see the strong connection with Alexandria and Philo, or the Judaism of which Philo is the main expression, because there is the connection. And I think that every connection with pagan Hellenistic philosophies or whatever goes through the mediation of Hellenistic Judaism. I don't think that there is the direct connection. At least I haven't seen any. I think everything goes through, any connection goes through the Hellenistic Judaism, already digested and thought about, used these words and gave them a slightly or stronger, different meaning and so on. I think that's the reference point. Where exactly that has happened, I don't know. I tend to think about Alexandria, but...
Okay, since the lunch is not here yet, I just ask if there is any other comment or question. If not, I only want to add the very small things about, again, Ezra, because if I'm not wrong, it's for Ezra. I don't remember exactly the point in the book, one of the apocryphal book related to Ezra. Also, Ezra is defined as a high priest at one point. So this is just to give you... Aspetta. Yes, I don't remember.
Already in first Esdra of the Septuagint is high priest.
So probably
yeah.
That, I mean, yeah. Thank you. So this is just to give you, a 1+ to the use of the high priest related to figures that then can be related to Jesus. Okay, I think that we need a rest before lunch, and the lunch is downstairs, the ground floor again. So I invite you all, the people that gave a paper invited to join the lunch with us.